Welcome to Listening History Sleepy in the ancient Near East, where empires rose like dust clouds and fell like rain, where kingdoms claimed divine favor and gods walked among marble columns, where power was measured in chariots and tribute and the reach of armies that could level cities or build them according to royal whim. In this world of bronze and blood, of conquest and tribute, of the endless cycling of empire building and empire falling, one king stands apart not through the battles he fought but through the battles he avoided, not through the cities he conquered but through the city he built, not through the empire he expanded but through the wisdom he possessed, through the judgment he rendered, through the understanding that made his name synonymous with wisdom itself, that made Solomon into archetype, into the wise king against whom all other rulers would be measured, against whom all other wisdom would be compared, against whom the centuries would test their own understanding and find it wanting, would measure their own judgment and discover it inadequate, would compare their own insight and recognize it shallow, because Solomon became more than king, became more than ruler, became the embodiment of wisdom itself, became the standard by which wisdom is measured, became the name that means understanding, that signifies judgment. That represents the gift that God grants when God chooses to grant what humans most need but least often possess: the wisdom to govern justly, to judge rightly, to see through deception to truth, to understand hearts that words conceal, to discern what matters from what merely seems to matter, to choose what endures over what merely glitters, to build what will last rather than what will merely impress. The story begins not with conquest but with dream, not with warfare but with worship, not with Solomon grasping for power but with Solomon receiving gift, not with the young king demanding his due but with the young king being offered choice: ask what you will and it shall be given, and choosing not for himself but for those he would serve, choosing not power but understanding, choosing not wealth but wisdom, choosing what would enable him to judge justly rather than what would enable him to rule absolutely, choosing to be servant rather than choosing to be master, choosing the gift that would make his reign legendary not through the territory he controlled but through the justice he administered, not through the armies he commanded but through the judgments he rendered, not through the power he wielded but through the wisdom he embodied, the wisdom that would build the temple, that would answer the Queen of Sheba, that would write songs and proverbs, that would create the reign that represents Israel's golden age, the height from which everything after would be decline, the glory that memory would preserve when power had faded, when the kingdom had split, when the temple had burned, when everything Solomon built had been destroyed except what could not be destroyed: the memory of wisdom, the tradition of his judgment, the songs he wrote, the proverbs he coined, the reputation that would outlast his kingdom, that would survive his failures, that would endure through the centuries as testimony not to perfect rule, but to the possibility that wisdom matters, that judgment can be just, that understanding can illuminate, that a king can choose to serve rather than choosing to dominate, can choose wisdom over power, can choose the gift that makes rule legitimate rather than merely effective, that makes governance just rather than merely efficient, that makes kingship service rather than exploitation. But the story is not simple triumph. It is not merely celebration of wisdom's glory. is also the tragedy of wisdom's limits, the confession of wisdom's inadequacy, the acknowledgement that even Solomon with all his wisdom could not save himself from folly, could not preserve the kingdom from division, could not maintain the faithfulness that his reign began with, could not resist the loves that led him astray, could not overcome the human weaknesses that wisdom illuminates but cannot eliminate, that understanding reveals but cannot remedy, that knowledge describes but cannot defeat. The story of Solomon is story of gift and failure, of wisdom and folly, of building and destroying, of the reign that was both Israel's height and the beginning of Israel's fall. Both the glory that memory celebrates and the cautionary tale that tradition preserves, both the achievement that inspires and the tragedy that warns, both the king who possessed wisdom beyond measure and the man who could not be saved by the wisdom he possessed, who built the temple but also built altars to foreign gods, who judged rightly between mothers but could not judge rightly in his own heart, who answered every riddle but could not answer the riddle of his own existence, who possessed everything but found in everything only vanity, only chasing after wind, only the emptiness that Ecclesiastes confesses, that the divided kingdom demonstrates, that the burned temple confirms that wisdom is not enough, that knowledge cannot save, that understanding cannot redeem, that even Solomon needed more than wisdom. Needed what wisdom could not provide, needed grace that wisdom cannot earn, needed salvation that knowledge cannot achieve, needed what the story preserves through showing its absence, through demonstrating its necessity, through the tragedy that makes Solomon both hero and warning, both achievement and failure, both the wise king and the foolish man, both the builder of glory and the source of division, both everything that wisdom can accomplish and everything that wisdom cannot prevent. Tonight we enter Solomon's world. We witness the dream at Gibon where wisdom chose the dreamer. We stand in the throne room where the sword stopped before dividing the child. We walk through the temple where silence learned to dwell in stone. We meet the queen who came to test what cannot be measured. We read the songs where desire became prayer. We hear Ecclesiastes confess the vanity that wisdom finally acknowledged. We see the wives who led the heart that held the kingdom. We consider the legends of the ring that commanded demons. We approach the darkness where the ark dwelt. We mourn the treasures that vanished when Babylon came. We understand the wisdom that could not save the one who possessed it. And we preserve the memory that outlasted the kingdom, that survives in us who tell these stories still, who remember this king still, who honor through remembering the wise king whose wisdom was gift, whose reign was glory, whose failure was tragedy, whose memory is the inheritance we preserve. We continue, we pass on through telling what happened when wisdom chose the dreamer, when Solomon asked not for himself but for his people, when the gift was granted and the reign began that would be remembered forever. That would be told forever, that would teach forever what Solomon teaches, that wisdom is gift, that judgment matters, that understanding illuminates, but that wisdom is not enough, that we need more than wisdom, that even Solomon could not be saved by wisdom alone, that the wise king teaches through his wisdom and through his folly, through his building and through his failing, through his glory and through his tragedy, through the reign that was Israel's height and through the division that followed. Through the temple that was built and through the temple that burned, through everything that Solomon was and everything that Solomon teaches, everything that his story preserves, everything that his memory maintains in the tradition we inherit, we continue, we honor through telling still, through remembering still, through the stories that survive kingdoms, that outlast power, that preserve in memory what history destroys in time. Let us begin. Let the evening deepen. Let the ancient king appear in the stories we tell, in the wisdom we remember, in the tradition we maintain. Solomon waits in dreams and judgments, in temples and songs, in vanity and memory, in the story that we tell, that we preserve, that we offer as gift to the night that receives it, to the sleep that honors it, to the dreams that continue it. Now, let us enter the dream where wisdom chose the dreamer, where Solomon became the wise king, where the story began that we remember still. At Gibon, upon the great high place where sacrifice was offered and prayers ascended, where the sacred space held the presence that temples would later house but that now dwelt in the open, in the height that brought earth closer to heaven, in the elevation that made the boundary between human and divine thinner, more permeable, more crossable. At Gibon, the young king slept. Not in palace chambers with guards posted and luxury surrounding, but upon stone at the sacred site, upon the high place where divinity was accessible, where dreams could become more than dreams, where the sleeping mind could encounter what waking consciousness could not reach, where Solomon, in the vulnerability of sleep, in the openness of dream, in the receptivity that unconsciousness creates, would meet God not in thunder or earthquake or fire, but in the intimate space of dream. In the chamber where choice becomes destiny, where asking becomes receiving, where the young king who had inherited the throne from David, who had secured his position through the elimination of rivals, who now ruled Israel but who knew that ruling and ruling well were different things, that possessing power and wielding it justly were separate achievements, that being king and being good king required what he did not yet possess, would be offered choice, would be given opportunity. He would hear in dream the question that would define his reign: ask what you will and it shall be given. What would you choose if choice were limitless? If God appeared in dream and offered to grant whatever you requested, what would you ask for? The question is not hypothetical for Solomon, is not philosophical exercise, is not theoretical exploration. It is the actual encounter that the dream at Gibon creates, that the sacred space enables, that the divine generosity offers to the young king who must choose, who must decide, who must reveal through asking what matters most to him, what he values highest, what he understands as most necessary for the work he faces, for the responsibility he bears, for the people he governs. The choice is test, is revelation of character. It is the moment when what Solomon truly is becomes visible through what Solomon asks for, through what he chooses when choosing is unlimited, through what he values when value can be expressed without constraint, through what he requests when request can encompass anything, when desire need not be limited by possibility, when the asking can reach as high as aspiration reaches, as deep as need descends, as wide as understanding extends. Solomon does not ask for long life, does not request the years that would allow him to see his work completed, to enjoy his achievements, to live beyond the limits that mortality imposes. does not ask for riches, does not request the wealth that would make his kingdom prosperous, that would make his court glorious, that would make his name impressive among the nations that measure greatness through treasure. Does not ask for victory over enemies, does not request the military success that would secure his borders, that would make Israel dominant, that would establish through conquest the power that David established, but that always requires maintaining, always demands defending, always needs the vigilance that makes rulers anxious, that makes sleep difficult, that makes every neighboring kingdom into potential threat. Solomon asks for none of these. He asks instead for what reveals the asker, for what demonstrates through the choosing the wisdom that makes the choosing possible, for what shows that the one who asks understands what matters most. He asks for wisdom, asks for the understanding heart, for the capacity to judge between good and evil, for the discernment that sees through surface to substance, through claim to truth, through words to hearts, for the knowledge that serves rather than the power that dominates, and for the gift that enables just rule rather than the might that enables absolute rule. The request is itself wisdom. The asking demonstrates what is asked for. The choice reveals that the chooser already possesses in seed what he requests in fullness, already understands in principle what he seeks to understand in practice, already knows enough to know what he needs, already has the beginning of wisdom that recognizes that wisdom is what is needed, that understanding is what will enable the work, that the capacity to judge justly is the capacity that kingship requires if kingship is to be service rather than exploitation. If rule is to be for the people rather than over the people, if power is to be tool for justice rather than instrument for oppression. The choice made in dream echoes through waking life. God's response is generous because you have asked for this, because you have not asked for yourself but for your ability to serve, because you have chosen wisdom over wealth and understanding over victory. I will give you what you asked and will give you also what you did not ask. Riches and honor beyond measure, life extended if you follow my ways, the blessings that follow wisdom, the gifts that accompany understanding, the rewards that come not through seeking reward but through seeking what makes reward meaningful, what makes wealth worthwhile, what makes power legitimate, what makes life worth living, the wisdom that sees truly, that judges justly, that understands deeply, that makes Solomon into the wise king, into the one whose name becomes synonymous with wisdom, into the ruler whose judgment becomes legendary, whose understanding becomes proverbial, whose wisdom becomes the standard against which all other wisdom is measured. But the dream raises questions even as it answers them. What is wisdom? What does it mean to possess the understanding heart? Is wisdom knowledge the accumulation of facts and principles and techniques that can be taught and learned and applied? Or is wisdom something else, something more, something that transcends mere knowledge, that encompasses but exceeds information, that includes understanding but extends beyond it into the realm of judgment, of discernment, of the capacity to apply knowledge appropriately, to understand contexts, to recognize nuances, to see connections, to perceive patterns, to make the right choice in the moment when choice matters, to judge justly when judgment is required, to speak truly when truth is needed. and to act wisely when action determines outcomes. The text does not define wisdom abstractly, does not theorize about what wisdom is, shows instead what wisdom does, enables Solomon to judge between the mothers, to answer the queen's questions, to build the temple, to write songs and proverbs, to rule justly, to make Israel prosper, to create the golden age that memory preserves, that tradition celebrates, that the narrative presents as the height from which everything after is decline. Yet the dream also contains shadow. It contains the conditions: if you walk in my ways, if you keep my statutes, then your life will be long. Conditions that anticipate the failure, that hint at the tragedy that will follow the glory, that suggest that wisdom is not guarantee, that the gift can be squandered, that even wisdom cannot protect against the choices that will lead Solomon astray, that will bring the foreign wives and the foreign gods and the divided heart and the divided kingdom and all the consequences that the dream's conditions anticipate. That the narrative will describe, that the tradition will preserve as warning, that wisdom is gift but is not magic, is understanding but is not protection, is illumination but is not salvation, is what Solomon asked for and received but is not what will save him from himself, from his desires, from the choices he will make despite knowing better, despite understanding where they lied, despite possessing the wisdom that should prevent them, but that will not prevent them because wisdom is not virtue. Understanding is not will, knowledge is not the power to do what knowledge shows should be done. The dream ends, the morning comes. Solomon wakes at Gibon and returns to Jerusalem and begins the reign that the dream enabled, that the gift empowers, that the wisdom will guide until it fails, until the heart is led astray, until the conditions are broken and the promise is lost and the kingdom is divided and the glory ends and only the memory remains, the memory of the dream at Gibon, of the choice that revealed the chooser, of the wisdom that was asked for and granted, of the reign that the gift made glorious. Of the king who chose understanding over power and who teaches through that choosing, through that gift, through the wisdom that he possessed and the folly that he fell into, through the glory and the tragedy, through everything that Solomon was and everything that Solomon teaches, that wisdom is gift, that choosing rightly matters, that understanding is what kingship requires. But that wisdom is not enough, that gift must be maintained, that the choice at Gibon must be renewed daily. That the wisdom that was granted must be preserved through obedience, through faithfulness, through keeping the ways that the conditions specified, through walking in the paths that make wisdom effective, that make understanding endure, that make the gift permanent rather than temporary, that make Solomon wise not just at Gibon but throughout his reign, not just in youth but into old age, not just in the glory but through the decline, not just when choosing initially but when choosing continuously matters. When the choice must be made again and again and again to remain wise, to stay faithful, to keep the heart undivided, to maintain the devotion that the dream began but that the life must continue if wisdom is to save, if understanding is to preserve, if the gift is to endure. We close standing at Gibon where the young king slept, where the dream came, where wisdom chose the dreamer and the dreamer chose wisdom in the sacred exchange that began the reign, that created the legend, that established Solomon as the wise king whose wisdom was gift, whose choice revealed character, whose asking demonstrated understanding, whose dream at Jibon marks the moment when kingship became service, when power became tool for justice, when rule became opportunity for righteousness. When the choice was made that would define everything that followed, the glory and the tragedy, the building and the division, the temple and the altars, the wisdom and the folly, everything that Solomon would be and everything that Solomon would teach, everything that the dream at Jibon began, everything that the choice created, everything that wisdom chose when wisdom chose the dreamer and the dreamer chose wisdom in the sacred moment that we remember, that we honor, that we preserve through telling the dream where wisdom chose the dreamer, where Solomon became the wise king, where the reign began that we remember still. The throne room in Jerusalem, where morning light falls slant through high windows, where the young king sits in judgment, where the people bring their disputes and their claims and their accusations, seeking the wisdom that Solomon promised, that God granted, that the dream at Jibon made possible. In this room 2 women stand before the king, each claiming the living child as hers, each accusing the other of the substitution that grief created, of the theft that loss motivated, of the switching that happened in darkness when one infant died and the surviving infant became the object of competing claims, of disputed ownership, of the accusation that cannot be resolved through evidence because no witness exists, because the night concealed what happened, because only the 2 women know the truth and they tell opposite stories, make contradictory claims, present testimonies that cancel each other, that create the dilemma that brings them before Solomon, whose wisdom must now prove itself. You must demonstrate what the dream promised, must show what understanding means when understanding faces the case that facts cannot settle, that evidence cannot resolve, that requires seeing beyond words to hearts, beyond claims to truth, beyond the surface that deceives to the depth that reveals. Solomon listens. He hears the first woman's claim: we live in the same house, we both gave birth within days of each other, her child died in the night and she took mine while I slept, switched the dead child for the living one, and when I woke to nurse I found the dead child beside me and knew immediately it was not mine, that mine had been taken, that she had stolen him to replace her loss. He hears the second woman's counterclaim: no, the living child is mine, the dead child is hers, she lies to take what belongs to me, to steal through false accusation what she lost through misfortune. The claims mirror each other, the accusations balance. The testimonies provide no way to judge because no evidence supports either claim, because both stories are plausible, because grief could motivate such theft, because love could justify such lies, because mothers defending their children cannot be trusted to tell truth when truth threatens to take the child away, when honesty means loss, when admission means surrender. The case is impossible. Is the dispute that should not be brought before kings because kings cannot judge where facts cannot establish, where evidence cannot illuminate, where the truth is hidden in the night that only the 2 women witnessed, that only they know, that one of them lies about and the other tells truth about, but which is which cannot be determined through questioning, through examination, through any of the normal means that judges use to find truth, to establish facts, to determine what happened when competing claims create uncertainty. The case should be dismissed, should be declared unsolvable, should be left to the women to resolve between themselves, because the king cannot judge without evidence, cannot rule without facts, cannot discern between competing testimonies that are equally plausible, equally passionate, equally certain in their claims. But Solomon does not dismiss the case, does not declare it unsolvable, does not send the women away. Instead makes the judgment that will become legendary, that will demonstrate the wisdom that God granted, that will show what understanding means when understanding penetrates beyond facts to hearts, when wisdom sees what evidence cannot show, when the capacity to judge between good and evil operates not through analyzing evidence but through understanding how truth appears, how love acts, how the authentic mother reveals herself not through what she says but through what she does when faced with the unthinkable. And when confronted with the choice that the sword creates, "Bring me a sword," Solomon commands, the blade gleams in the morning light. The terrible logic seems fair, seems just, seems like the solution that treats both women equally if the child cannot be given to one without denying the other. If truth cannot be established to satisfy both claims, if justice cannot be achieved through determining who lies and who tells truth, then divide the child, give half to each woman, let both have equally what neither can have wholly. Let the sword create the solution that wisdom cannot create, that evidence cannot establish. That judgment cannot achieve through normal means. The logic is terrible but is also brilliant because the logic is not the solution. The sword is not the answer, the dividing is not the judgment. The threat is the test that reveals what words concealed, that makes visible what testimonies hid, that forces the truth to appear not through investigation but through reaction, not through evidence but through exposure, not through facts but through the choices that impossible choices create. One woman agrees. "If I cannot have him, neither shall she. Better that the child should die than that my rival should triumph. Better that justice should be done even if justice means death than that injustice should prevail and she should possess what is mine. Divide the child, let the sword fall, let the terrible fairness be executed. Let both mothers lose what neither can win if winning means the other loses, if having means the rival is denied, if possession requires that the competitor be defeated, even if defeat means death, even if fairness means destruction, even if justice requires that what cannot be given to one must be denied to both, must be divided so that neither fully has what cannot be fairly given." The other woman cries out. Screams the words that reveal the heart, that expose the truth, that make visible through the reaction what the testimony concealed. Give her the living child. Do not kill him. I surrender my claim rather than see him harmed. I yield my rights rather than watch him die. I choose his life over my victory, his survival over my claim, his safety over my possession, because loving him means wanting him alive, even if alive means losing him, even if survival means she wins and I lose. Even if preservation means surrender and defeat and grief, but at least means that he lives, that he survives, that the sword stops before dividing, that the child continues even if continuing means I cannot mother him, cannot raise him, cannot have what I claimed but what I now yield for his sake, for his life, for the love that would rather lose him to her than lose him to death. The sword stops. The truth stands revealed. the false mother was willing to accept death to prevent her rival's victory. The true mother was willing to surrender victory to preserve the child's life. The judgment is clear. The wisdom is demonstrated. Solomon gives the living child to the woman who would give him away, recognizing what the sword revealed, that true love releases rather than possesses, that authentic motherhood chooses the child's welfare over the mother's claim, that the heart willing to lose everything to preserve life is the heart that deserves to receive life, to nurture it, to mother the child she was willing to surrender for his sake. The judgment spreads. Israel hears of the wisdom that saw through deception, that used threat to reveal truth, that found what evidence could not find through understanding how love acts, how authenticity appears, how the heart betrays itself under pressure that words cannot create but threatened loss exposes. The people fear the king, not the fear of terror, but the fear of reverence, the recognition that Solomon possesses what they hoped he possessed, what the dream promised he would possess, what the judgment demonstrates he does possess. The understanding heart, the capacity to judge between good and evil, the wisdom that sees truly when seeing matters most, that judges justly when judgment determines destiny, that understands deeply when understanding makes the difference between justice and injustice, between truth and deception, between giving the child to the mother who loves him and giving him to the woman who merely claims him. Yet the judgment also raises questions. Was the threat real? Would Solomon have divided the child if both women had agreed? Was the sword the test, or was the test itself the judgment? The text does not clarify. It does not explain whether Solomon would have followed through, or whether the threat was always only revelation tool, always only the means of exposing what testimony concealed, always only the test that made truth visible through making choice impossible, through creating the situation where love must reveal itself because remaining hidden means accepting the unacceptable, means allowing the sword to fall, means permitting the division that love cannot permit, that true motherhood cannot accept. That the authentic heart must cry out against even when crying out means losing, means surrendering, means the defeat that love chooses over the death that victory would require. We close contemplating the brilliance and the terror, the wisdom that threatened a child to save him, that used fear to reveal love, that found truth by proposing horror, that judged rightly by seeming to judge wrongly, that preserved life by threatening death. The judgment that split hearts before swords teaches what it teaches through the method, through the test, through the understanding that hearts reveal themselves under pressure, that truth appears when choices become impossible, that love shows itself when surrender becomes necessary, that the sword that stopped taught more than the sword that fell could teach, that the wisdom that saw how to make visible what was hidden is the wisdom that God granted, that the dream promised, that the judgment demonstrates. That Solomon possessed, and that makes his name synonymous with wisdom, that makes his judgment legendary. That makes the story of the two mothers and the threatened sword into the teaching that endures, that wisdom sees what facts cannot show, that understanding penetrates where evidence fails, that judgment operates through knowing how truth appears, how love acts, how hearts reveal themselves when revelation matters most, when the sword threatens. When the choice becomes impossible and the impossible choice reveals what must be revealed if justice is to be done, if truth is to prevail, if the child is to be given to the mother whose love for him exceeds her love for winning, whose care for his life surpasses her claim to possess his life, whose heart the sword revealed before the sword divided, whose love the judgment honored through giving her what she surrendered, through preserving what she released, through the wisdom that saw truly, that judged justly. That split hearts before swords and found truth in the splitting. The mountain waits Mount Moriah, where Abraham bound Isaac, where the angel's sword stopped, where the thrashing floor of Araunah became sacred ground that David purchased, that David prepared though God denied him the building, reserving the construction for Solomon, whose hands had not shed blood in warfare, whose reign brought peace that made building possible, that created conditions where 7 years of labor could produce the house that Israel had never possessed, the temple that would replace the tent of meeting. The permanent dwelling that would house the ark, that would establish Jerusalem not merely as political capital but as religious center, as the place where the name would dwell, where prayers would ascend, where sacrifices would be offered, where Israel would orient itself toward this mountain, this temple, this sacred architecture that Solomon builds not from his own vision alone but from plans that David received, from preparations that David made, from the materials that David gathered though David could not build. Though the prophet Nathan told David that his son would build the house, that David's role was preparation rather than construction, was gathering rather than building, was the accumulation of materials and wealth and vision that Solomon would inherit and would use to create the temple that rises now on Mount Moriah. That takes 7 years to complete, that employs tens of thousands of workers, that requires cedar from Lebanon brought by sea from Tyre. That demands gold beyond measure to cover walls and furnishings, that needs the skill of craftsmen from Israel and from Tyre who work in stone and wood and metal, who create beauty that serves worship, who make architecture that makes visible the invisible, that gives form to the formless, that provides dwelling place for the God who cannot be contained by dwelling places, who transcends temples even while consenting to inhabit them, who remains beyond while becoming present, who preserves transcendence while accepting localization, who remains the God of heaven and earth while dwelling in the house that Solomon builds on Mount Moriah, where the temple rises level by level, chamber by chamber, court within court, advancing from the outer courts where Gentiles may enter to the inner courts where only Israel may come to the holy place where only priests may serve to the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest may enter only once yearly on Yom Kippur, when atonement is made. When blood is sprinkled, when the innermost sanctum is approached with fear and trembling, with smoke and incense, with the awareness that to approach the Holy of Holies inappropriately is to approach death, is to encounter the holiness that human sin cannot survive unmediated, that requires priest and sacrifice and proper procedure to approach safely, to enter without dying, to perform the ritual and emerge alive from the chamber where the ark dwells, where the tablets rest. Where the presence of God concentrates in darkness absolute, in the chamber without windows, without lamps, without any illumination except what the high priest brings when he enters trembling, when he crosses the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place, when he approaches what cannot be approached except through mediation, through proper channels, through the system that the temple creates, that the sacrifices enable. That makes the transcendent God accessible while maintaining the holiness that human sin cannot casually approach. That requires the complex system of priesthood and sacrifice and ritual purity that the temple embodies, that the architecture serves, that the 7 years of building creates. The dedication comes when building is complete, when the furnishings are in place, when the priests have been consecrated and the sacrifices prepared, and the people have gathered to witness the moment when the ark is brought from the tent where David placed it into the temple that Solomon built, when the presence that dwelt in the tent will dwell in the temple, when the transition happens from temporary to permanent, from tent to house, and from the mobility that wilderness wandering required to the stability that settled existence enables, from the architecture that could be dismantled and carried to the architecture that stands permanent on Mount Moriah, that cannot be moved, that fixes Israel's worship in Jerusalem, that makes this place the place where prayers must be directed, where pilgrimage must come, where the great festivals must be celebrated, where Israel must orient itself if Israel is to maintain the covenant, to keep the law. And to worship the God who dwells in the temple that Solomon dedicates with prayer that acknowledges what the temple is, and what the temple is not, the heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built. The prayer is profound. It is theological sophistication that recognizes that the temple is not container but is meeting place, is not prison for God but is portal to God, is not reduction of divine presence to human architecture but is divine condescension to provide place where encounter can happen, where prayers can be directed, where Israel can come knowing that God will hear, will receive, will respond to the prayers offered here, to the sacrifices made here, and to the worship conducted here according to the law that Moses received, that David prepared for, that Solomon now establishes through building the temple that will stand for nearly 4 centuries until Babylon destroys it, that will be rebuilt after exile as second temple that will stand until Rome destroys it, that will never be built again except in the longing that preserves temple in memory, in ritual, in the prayers that direct themselves toward the absent temple, toward the destroyed sanctuary, toward the place where temple stood and where temple remains in the imagination that cannot let go, that preserves through remembering, that maintains through longing the temple where silence learned to dwell in stone. For the temple is not merely architecture, is not simply building. It is the space where silence becomes sacred, where the absence of sound becomes presence of holiness, where the quiet that the stone creates becomes the condition in which prayer can be heard, in which God can speak, in which the encounter that the temple exists to enable can happen. The temple teaches through its silence what noise cannot teach, through its stillness what motion cannot reveal, through its sacred quiet what chaos obscures. And to enter the temple is to enter silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, not the silence that is merely lack of sound, but the silence that is the sound of the sacred, the breath of holiness. The voice of God that speaks not in thunder but in stillness, not in earthquake but in quiet, not in fire but in the gentle silence that the temple creates, that the stone holds. That the architecture preserves as dwelling place not just for ark and tablets, but for the silence that makes hearing possible, that makes prayer effective, that makes worship real, that makes the temple into what the temple is, the place where silence learned to dwell in stone, where quiet became sacred, where the absence of noise revealed the presence of holiness, where the stone architecture created acoustic space that is also spiritual space, that is also the chamber where God and Israel meet. Where prayers ascend and glory descends, where the covenant is maintained through the sacrifices that the temple enables, through the worship that the temple structures, through the encounter that the temple makes possible while maintaining the boundaries that holiness requires, the separations that protect human life from divine holiness, the mediation that makes approach possible without making approach casual, that preserves mystery while providing access, that maintains transcendence while offering presence. That keeps God beyond while bringing God near. That makes the temple into the paradox that it is the house that cannot contain God but that God consents to inhabit. The architecture that cannot limit the infinite but that the infinite accepts as dwelling place. The stone building that wisdom constructs and that silence fills, that Solomon dedicates and that God consecrates through the cloud that fills the temple when dedication is complete, through the glory that descends so thickly that priests cannot enter. That makes visible the invisible presence, that demonstrates that God has accepted the house, has come to dwell, has made the temple into temple, has transformed Solomon's architecture into sacred space, has filled the silence with presence, has made the stone into dwelling place for the God who dwells in the temple where silence learned to dwell in stone, where quiet became holy, where the architecture that Solomon built became the sanctuary that Israel needed, that worship required. That the covenant demanded, that stood on Mount Moriah teaching what it taught through being what it was, not merely building but dwelling place, not merely architecture but sanctuary, not merely stone but the temple where silence learned to dwell, where God consented to inhabit, where Israel came to pray, to sacrifice, to encounter the presence that the temple held in the silence, in the stone. In the sacred space where the temple stood, teaching what temples teach when built truly, that the sacred requires silence, that presence dwells in quiet, that God speaks in stillness, that the temple where silence learned to dwell in stone is the temple that serves its purpose, that enables its function, that creates the space where encounter happens, where prayer ascends, where worship becomes real, where Israel meets God in the temple that Solomon built, that silence fills, that stone preserves, that memory honors. And that we remember as the place where silence learned to dwell in stone. And from the south she comes, the Queen of Sheba, whose kingdom the desert conceals, whose wealth the distances protect, whose curiosity the rumors provoke. The reports that travel along trade routes carrying not only spices and gold but also stories, accounts, testimonies about the king in Jerusalem whose wisdom surpasses understanding, whose wealth exceeds imagining, whose temple rivals heaven, whose court displays splendor that seems impossible, that sounds exaggerated. That brings the queen across deserts with camels bearing gifts worthy of the reputation she comes to verify, with retinue that testifies to her own power, with questions that she has prepared to test whether the wisdom is real, whether the king deserves the reputation that reaches even to Sheba, whether Jerusalem merits the journey of months across hostile terrain, whether Solomon equals the legend that the merchants tell, that the travelers describe, that the reports claim with superlatives that seem too extravagant to be true, that require verification, that demand testing, that bring the queen to Jerusalem not as supplicant but as sovereign, not as inferior but as equal, not to pay tribute but to assess, to measure, to test what cannot be measured but what she will attempt to measure nonetheless through the questions she asks, through the riddles she poses, through the examination that wisdom invites, that excellence provokes. That greatness demands from those who hear of it and must know whether the hearing tells truth or spreads fantasy. The queen arrives, enters Jerusalem, sees the palace that Solomon built, the throne room where he sits, the court that surrounds him, observes the organization, the efficiency, the wealth displayed in gold vessels and purple garments, in the architecture that impresses, in the abundance that testifies to prosperity. But observation is not testing, seeing is not measuring. The queen came not merely to witness but to question, to challenge, to pose the riddles that will reveal whether Solomon's wisdom is mere reputation or is actual capacity, whether he can answer what she asks, whether he can solve what she proposes, whether the wisdom that legend claims is wisdom that reality demonstrates. The questions come. The riddles are posed. The text does not preserve them, does not tell us what the queen asked, what puzzles she presented, what challenges she offered. Later tradition fills the silence with legends that she tested Solomon with riddles about nature, about human behavior, about paradoxes that require insight rather than information to solve, about questions that have no simple answers, that demand understanding rather than knowledge, that reveal whether wisdom is present through how wisdom responds, through what wisdom sees, through the connections that wisdom makes between apparently unrelated things, through the insight that penetrates surface to recognize pattern. To discern structure, to understand what questions really ask beneath what questions seem to ask. Solomon answers everything, solves every riddle, responds to every question. Demonstrates through answering that the reputation was earned, that the wisdom is real, that what the merchants reported was not exaggeration but was understatement, was less than the reality, was the half that was not told because the full truth exceeds what report can convey, what hearing can imagine, what the queen expected despite preparing herself to be impressed, despite coming ready to acknowledge excellence if excellence was present. But what she encounters exceeds preparation, surpasses expectation, makes her realize that the reports, however superlative, however extravagant, however impossible they seemed, did not capture the reality, did not convey the full measure, did not tell the half of what Solomon is, of what his wisdom encompasses, of what his court displays, of what his kingdom achieves. The queen speaks her acknowledgment. Blessed be the Lord your God who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel. And because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king to execute justice and righteousness. The blessing is profound. Is theological recognition that Solomon's wisdom is gift, that his rule is divine appointment, that what the queen witnesses is not merely human achievement but is grace, is the result of God's love for Israel that provided the king Israel needed, that granted the wisdom that just rule requires, that established Solomon on the throne not through Solomon's grasping but through God's giving, not through human achievement but through divine blessing, not through power that takes but through grace that grants. But the blessing is also comparison. Is the queen recognizing that what she sees in Jerusalem exceeds what she possesses in Sheba, that Solomon's wisdom surpasses her wisdom, that his wealth exceeds her wealth, that his court displays what hers cannot match, that the half was not told because the reality surpasses the report, because experiencing exceeds hearing, because presence reveals what absence could only imagine? The queen came to test, came to measure. It came to verify whether Solomon deserved the reputation. What she discovers is that Solomon exceeds the reputation, that measurement fails before the reality, that testing confirms what it sought to question but confirms it through overwhelming, through surpassing expectation, through demonstrating that what was claimed was true but was incomplete, was accurate but was insufficient, was honest but was inadequate to capture the fullness, to convey the reality, to prepare the queen for what she would encounter when she met Solomon, when she heard his wisdom. When she witnessed his court, when she saw the temple, when she experienced what report could only describe, what distance could only imagine, what hearing could only approximate, the exchange is mutual. The queen gives gifts gold and spices and precious stones, the wealth of Sheba offered not as tribute but as honor, not as submission but as acknowledgement, not as inferior to superior but as peer to peer, as one sovereign honoring another, as one ruler recognizing excellence in another, as equals exchanging gifts that signify respect, that demonstrate appreciation, that create relationship. Solomon gives gifts in return, gives from his abundance, from his wealth, from the resources that his kingdom possesses, gives whatever the queen desired and asked for in addition to what he gave of his own royal bounty. The exchange is generous, is royal. Is the mutual recognition that excellence deserves honor, that wisdom warrants respect, that the meeting of sovereigns creates opportunity for relationship that trade alone cannot create, that politics alone cannot establish, that requires the personal encounter, the mutual recognition, the acknowledgement that happens when the queen who came to test discovers that testing fails, that measuring is inadequate, that Solomon exceeds what measurement can capture, what testing can verify. What the queen can fully comprehend despite her own wisdom, despite her own excellence, despite her own achievements that make her queen of a wealthy kingdom, but that seem diminished when compared to Solomon's wisdom and wealth, when measured against Jerusalem's glory, when set beside the temple's splendor. The queen departs, returns to Sheba. And carries with her what cannot be carried, the memory of wisdom encountered, of excellence witnessed, of the king whose reality exceeded reputation, whose wisdom surpassed report, whose court demonstrated what Jerusalem claimed, whose answers proved what rumor suggested, whose presence transformed the queen who came to test into the queen who came to testify, who came skeptical and departed believing, who came questioning and departed blessing, who came to measure and departed acknowledging that measurement failed. That testing confirmed rather than questioned, that the journey revealed what distance had concealed, that Solomon was what Israel said he was, that the wisdom was real, that the wealth was authentic, that the temple was glorious, that the half was not told because the whole cannot be told, because the reality exceeds the reporting, because Solomon must be encountered rather than described, must be witnessed rather than reported, must be experienced rather than heard about if the full truth is to be known. If the reality is to be appreciated, if the wisdom is to be understood not as abstract quality but as lived reality, as actual capacity, as the gift that God granted and that Solomon possesses and that the Queen verified through the testing that became witnessing, through the measuring that became acknowledging, through the journey that brought her from Sheba to Jerusalem and that returns her transformed, carrying the memory that will outlast the kingdom, that will survive the glory. That will preserve in Sheba's own traditions the account of the queen who came to test what cannot be measured and who discovered that measurement fails before excellence. That testing confirms rather than questions when what is tested is real, when what is measured surpasses measurement, when what is examined exceeds examination, when Solomon demonstrates through being what reputation claims through telling, when the queen learns what we learn through her story, that wisdom must be encountered. That excellence must be witnessed, that some realities exceed report, that Solomon was the wise king that legend claims, that Israel's golden age was real, that the half was not told because the whole cannot be told, because the telling cannot capture the being, because report cannot convey presence, because the queen who came to test learned what testing teaches when what is tested is genuine, when what is measured surpasses measurement. When what is questioned withstands questioning and reveals through withstanding that the questions themselves were inadequate, that the testing was insufficient, that measurement fails before the reality that Solomon was, that the wisdom demonstrated, that the queen acknowledged through the blessing she pronounced, through the gift she gave. Through the memory she carried back to Sheba, where it remains still in the traditions that preserve the story of the queen who came to test what cannot be measured, and who learned that excellence exceeds measurement, that wisdom surpasses testing, that Solomon was real. In scrolls that blush with intimacy, in verses that blur the boundary between sacred and sensual, between the love of God and the love of lovers, between spiritual longing and physical desire, the Song of Songs breathes words so tender they seem almost forbidden, so passionate they seem inappropriate for scripture, so erotic they demand interpretation that makes them metaphor that transforms the lovers into God and Israel, the bride into the faithful people, the groom into the divine beloved. The kisses into covenant, the embraces into devotion, the vineyard into something other than vineyard, the breasts into something other than breasts, the desire into something other than desire, as if the text cannot mean what the text says, as if scripture cannot celebrate what the song celebrates, the joy of physical love, the beauty of desire, the holiness of the erotic when experienced within covenant, within commitment, within the relationship that makes passion sacred rather than shameful. That makes desire gift rather than temptation, that makes physical intimacy into prayer, into worship, into the celebrating of what God created and called good. What the song honors without apology, without spiritualizing disclaimer, without the embarrassment that later interpretation feels when reading verses that speak plainly of bodies and pleasure, of longing and fulfillment, of the beloved whose voice is sweet and whose form is lovely. Of the lover whose desire is for the beloved and whose delight is mutual, whose passion is reciprocal, whose love is celebrated in language so beautiful it became scripture, so honest it required explanation, so passionate it demanded interpretation that would make it safe by making it symbolic, that would make it acceptable by making it allegorical. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. The opening is bold, is direct. Is the voice of desire unashamed, of longing unashamed, of the beloved speaking what the heart feels, what the body wants, what love desires, the kiss, the touch, the closeness that lovers seek, that passion motivates, that the song celebrates without qualification, without hesitation, without the modesty that would conceal desire behind euphemism, that would speak of love without speaking of bodies, that would honor relationship while denying physicality. The song will have none of this. Speaks plainly. Celebrates directly. Honors what God created, the body, the desire, the physical love that is not separate from spiritual love, but is expression of spiritual love, is embodiment of devotion, is the making flesh of the covenant that the song images through imaging lovers, through celebrating bride and groom, through speaking honestly about desire that tradition feels compelled to spiritualize, to allegorize, to transform into metaphor, because tradition assumes that scripture cannot celebrate physical love. That holiness excludes sexuality, that desire is shameful rather than sacred, that bodies are problems rather than gifts. But perhaps the song teaches otherwise. And perhaps the inclusion of this passionate poetry in Scripture is itself the teaching that desire is not shameful, that physical love within covenant is holy, that bodies are good because God made them good, that sexuality is gift because God created it as gift, that the love between husband and wife reflects the love between God and people not by being different from physical love, but by being physical love rightly ordered, rightly expressed, rightly celebrated within the covenant that makes desire sacred, that makes passion holy, that makes intimacy into prayer not by ceasing to be physical but by being physical within the relationship that honors both partners, that creates safety for vulnerability, that makes pleasure sacred through making commitment permanent, that transforms desire into devotion through the covenant that surrounds it, that gives it context, that makes it holy. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle that graze among the lilies. The image is sensual, is appreciative. Is the lover describing the beloved's body with delight, with desire, with the appreciation that sees beauty and speaks beauty, that recognizes gift and celebrates gift, that honors the body as body rather than pretending that bodies do not matter, that physical attraction is irrelevant, that desire is something to overcome rather than something to celebrate when celebrated rightly, when expressed appropriately, when experienced within covenant. The tradition reads this as metaphor. The two breasts become two testaments, two mountains, two anythings except breasts, because tradition cannot accept that scripture celebrates breasts, that the song speaks appreciation for the beloved's body, that physical attraction is honored rather than hidden, that desire is expressed rather than suppressed. But what if the song means what it says? What if the breasts are breasts, the vineyard is vineyard, the kisses are kisses, the desire is desire, the love between bride and groom is love between bride and groom? Not metaphor for something else but celebration of what it is, the physical love that God created, that covenant sanctifies, that husband and wife experience as gift, as joy, as the intimacy that reflects divine intimacy, not by being non-physical but by being rightly physical, by being embodied love within committed relationship. By being desire that serves rather than exploits, that gives rather than takes, that delights in mutual pleasure rather than demanding one-sided satisfaction, that makes intimacy sacred through making it mutual, consensual, covenantal, the love that the song celebrates, that tradition spiritualizes, that interpretation transforms into allegory because interpretation assumes that bodies are problems rather than gifts, that desire is temptation rather than blessing. That physical love must be explained away rather than celebrated as it is, as the song celebrates it, as scripture preserves it in verses that tradition attributes to Solomon. That wisdom includes in the canon, that the community preserved despite the passion, despite the eroticism, despite the plain speaking about bodies and desire and physical love that makes interpreters uncomfortable, that makes allegory necessary if scripture is to remain respectable, if the song is to remain acceptable. If the passion is to be acknowledged without being affirmed as passion, if the eroticism is to be included without being celebrated as eroticism. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. The mutuality is profound, is the essence of covenant. Is the recognition that love is not possession but is mutual belonging, not ownership but is reciprocal commitment, not one dominating and the other submitting but both giving and both receiving, both delighting and both being delighted in, both loving and both being loved in the relationship that the song describes, that covenant creates, that makes desire sacred through making relationship mutual, through honoring both partners, through celebrating the intimacy that is gift when experienced as gift. When given and received freely, when both partners delight in each other and both are delighted in, when the beloved is beloved not through submission but through choice, not through duty but through desire, not through obligation but through the love that makes mutuality possible, that makes intimacy joyful, that makes the song's passion into prayer, into worship, into the celebrating of what God created and called very good, the love between man and woman, the desire that covenant sanctifies. The physical intimacy that reflects spiritual intimacy, that embodies divine love, that makes the Song of Songs into prayer despite its eroticism, into scripture despite its sensuality, into the text where desire became prayer through celebrating what God created, through honoring what holiness includes, through speaking plainly about love and bodies and desire and pleasure and all that the song includes, all that tradition preserves, all that Solomon's wisdom recognizes as worthy of inclusion. As deserving of honor, as sacred despite the passion or sacred because of the passion, sacred through celebrating what is rather than through explaining it away, through honoring desire rather than through allegorizing it, through the plain speech that makes the song powerful, that makes it beautiful, that makes it the prayer that desire becomes when desire is celebrated rather than suppressed, when passion is honored rather than feared, when physical love within covenant is recognized as holy, as good. As the gift that God created and that the song celebrates, that tradition preserves, that we read wondering whether we can hear what the song says without transforming it into what we think it should say, whether we can celebrate desire without spiritualizing it away, whether we can honor bodies without pretending they do not matter, whether we can read the song as the song reads itself, as celebration of love, as honoring of desire, as the sacred made flesh, as the holy made embodied. As prayer that desire becomes when expressed rightly, when celebrated openly, when honored as gift rather than feared as temptation. As the song where desire became prayer and prayer became desire, and the boundary dissolved between loving God and loving the beloved, between spiritual longing and physical passion, between the sacred and the sensual, that the song teaches are not opposites but are unified in the love that God creates, that covenant celebrates. That the song preserves in verses where desire became prayer, where passion became holy, where intimacy became worship, where the song teaches what embarrassment obscures, that desire is gift, that passion is sacred, that physical love within covenant is prayer. A vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The words come bitter from the mouth that once spoke only wisdom, that answered riddles, that judged between mothers, that built the temple and received the queen and demonstrated excellence in everything until the excellence itself became the teacher, until the achievement itself revealed the emptiness, until the king who had everything discovered that everything is nothing, that all the wisdom and wealth and wives and works amount to vanity, to chasing after wind, and to the meaninglessness that Ecclesiastes confesses in verses so dark they seem to contradict the wisdom tradition they belong to, so pessimistic they seem to deny the faith they supposedly express, so honest about futility that they reveal what success conceals, that achievement does not satisfy, that accomplishment does not fulfill, that wisdom itself cannot answer the questions that wisdom raises, cannot solve the problems that understanding creates, cannot provide the meaning that it promises. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? The question is fundamental, is existential, is the challenge that all achievement faces, that all labor confronts, that all human endeavor must answer or must acknowledge cannot be answered. What is the point? What is gained? What remains when the toiling is done, when the achieving is complete, when death comes and takes the achiever and leaves the achievements to others who did not earn them, who may squander them, who will die in turn and leave them to others in the endless cycle that makes all labor seem futile, all achievement seem temporary, all the gaining seem like loss, because what is gained cannot be kept. What is achieved cannot be preserved beyond death. What is built will crumble, what is gathered will scatter. What is accomplished will be forgotten except by those who remember briefly before they too die and forget and are forgotten. Solomon speaks from experience, has achieved everything, has built the temple, has accumulated wealth beyond measure, has possessed wisdom that surpassed all before him, has enjoyed every pleasure, has denied himself nothing. Has tested everything that might provide meaning, that might answer the question of what makes life worthwhile, what makes toil meaningful, what makes achievement satisfying. Has tried wisdom and found that in much wisdom is much vexation, that increasing knowledge increases sorrow, that understanding reveals the futility that ignorance conceals. Has tried pleasure and found that laughter is mad, that pleasure accomplishes nothing, that joy pursued for its own sake leaves emptiness. Has tried great works, building houses, planting vineyards, making gardens and parks and pools, creating beauty and order and magnificence, and found that these too are vanity, that looking back on all that hands have done reveals only the futility of it all. It has tried possessions, gathering silver and gold, acquiring servants and herds, amassing wealth that exceeds all who came before, and found that this too is vanity, that possessions possess the possessor, that wealth creates anxiety, that abundance does not satisfy. It has tried women 700 wives and 300 concubines, and found that this multiplying of pleasure does not multiply satisfaction, that relationship pursued for pleasure becomes exploitation, that love divided among multitudes becomes love denied to each. All is vanity, all is chasing after wind. All the labor, all the achievement, all the wisdom, all the pleasure, all the possessions, all the relationships all amount to nothing, because death comes to wise and foolish alike, because the grave makes no distinction between achievement and failure, because in the end all is forgotten, all is lost, all returns to the dust from which it came. The pessimism is brutal, is honest. It is the confession that makes Ecclesiastes seem almost heretical, almost too dark for scripture, almost too nihilistic to belong in the canon that celebrates God's goodness, that proclaims meaning, that affirms that life matters, that achievement counts, that wisdom makes difference. But Ecclesiastes will have none of this comfort, strips away the illusions, removes the consolations. It faces directly the meaninglessness that death creates, the futility that mortality imposes, the vanity that honest assessment reveals when assessment is truly honest, when illusions are abandoned, when the pretense that achievement matters is confronted with the reality that all achievement ends, that all meaning is temporary, that all is vanity when measured against the eternity that we cannot grasp, cannot enter, cannot be satisfied by, because we are mortal, because we die. Because death takes everything we build and scatters it, takes everything we gather and disperses it, takes everything we achieve and erases it. Yet the book is not quite nihilistic. It contains hints of something beyond the vanity, glimpses of meaning that survive the meaninglessness, suggestions that not all is futile even if much is futile, that life can be lived well even if life cannot ultimately satisfy, that there are ways of being that honor reality without being crushed by reality, that acknowledge futility without surrendering to despair. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Though the conclusion seems inadequate after the nihilism that preceded it, seems like weak consolation after the brutal honesty that confessed the vanity. but perhaps the inadequacy is the point. Perhaps the weakness is the teaching. Perhaps what Ecclesiastes offers is not solution but acknowledgement that wisdom cannot save, that achievement does not satisfy, that meaning is not found through human striving, through human building, through human grasping after what cannot be grasped, but can only be received as gift if it comes, can only be accepted as grace if it is granted, can only be acknowledged as beyond human achieving, beyond human understanding. Beyond the wisdom that Solomon possessed in fullness, but that could not save him from the vanity, could not protect him from the meaninglessness, could not provide what wisdom cannot provide: salvation, redemption, the meaning that comes from beyond meaning, the satisfaction that transcends satisfaction, the life that death cannot take because it comes from beyond death, from beyond the vanity that Ecclesiastes describes, from beyond the futility that wisdom confesses. The confession is gift. It is the honesty that faith requires if faith is to be real, if faith is to engage reality rather than escaping reality, if faith is to acknowledge what is true rather than pretending what is false. All is vanity. The confession stands, cannot be refuted, cannot be denied by those who look honestly at life, at death, at the ending that makes all achievement temporary, all meaning provisional, all satisfaction incomplete. But the confession is not the end. It is the beginning of the journey toward what lies beyond vanity, toward what transcends futility, toward what wisdom points toward, even as wisdom confesses it cannot reach it, cannot grasp it, cannot achieve it through striving. The vanity that wisdom finally confessed is the vanity that we must confess if we would be honest, if we would be real, if we would acknowledge what Solomon acknowledged, that wisdom is not enough, that achievement does not satisfy, that all is vanity except what is not vanity, that all is meaningless except what gives meaning, that we cannot give meaning to ourselves, cannot earn it through wisdom or purchase it through wealth or achieve it through accomplishment, can only receive it if it comes, can only accept it as gift. I can only wait for it beyond the vanity, beyond the futility, beyond the chasing after wind that Ecclesiastes describes, that Solomon confessed, that the vanity teaches when wisdom finally admits that wisdom is not enough. 700 wives, 300 concubines, the numbers stagger, suggest impossibility, create image of harem so vast that relationship dissolves into management, that intimacy becomes administration, that marriage becomes politics, that the wives are not partners but are treaties, are alliances, are the diplomatic arrangements that peace requires, that security demands, that make Solomon's reign stable through making his household complex. Through creating the web of marriages that bind him to Egypt and Moab and Ammon and Edom and Sidon, to all the nations that Israel must live among, must trade with, must avoid warring with, and the marriages create the peace, purchase the security, establish the alliances that make prosperity possible, that make the building projects achievable, that make the glory of Solomon's reign depend upon the marriages that the law forbade, that Deuteronomy warned against: you shall not enter into marriage with them. Neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. The prohibition that Solomon violated, that the marriages broke, that the alliances required breaking if the alliances were to be secured, if the peace was to be maintained, if the kingdom was to be stable in a world where power is balanced through marriages, where treaties are sealed through dynastic unions, where security is purchased through giving daughters and receiving daughters, and creating the complex web of familial relationships that make war less likely, because war would set brother against brother-in-law, would divide families, would break bonds that blood creates even when blood is created through marriage, through political arrangement, through the wives who are policies made flesh, who are alliances made personal, who are the means by which kingdoms bind themselves to each other in world without international law. Without treaties that can be enforced except through the marriages that make enforcement personal, that make violation costly in ways that mere broken promises cannot make costly. But the marriage's exact cost from Solomon that the benefits to kingdom cannot compensate for, cannot make worthwhile, cannot justify when the cost is the heart, when the price is the faithfulness, when what is paid is the devotion that the dream at Gibon began, that the building of the temple demonstrated, that the wisdom required if wisdom was to remain wisdom, if Solomon was to remain Solomon, if the reign was to continue in the glory that the beginning promised. The wives demand their gods, who require their altars, insist that Solomon build high places where they can worship Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, where they can sacrifice to Chemosh, the god of Moab, where they can offer to Melech, the abomination of the Ammonites, where the foreign gods can be honored on the hills overlooking Jerusalem, where the temple of the Lord stands, but where now also stand the altars to gods that the Lord forbade, that the law prohibited, that the covenant excluded, that Solomon builds nonetheless because the wives require them. Because love compels them, because the desire to please moves him despite knowing better, despite understanding where this leads, despite the wisdom that should prevent him but that cannot prevent him because the heart is not governed by wisdom alone, is not controlled by knowledge alone, is not directed by understanding alone but is moved by love, is led by desire, is drawn by the loneliness that 700 wives create rather than cure because they are treaties rather than companions, are alliances rather than partners, are the political arrangements that bring the nations but not the intimacy that brings satisfaction, that provides companionship, that makes marriage worthwhile as marriage rather than merely useful as policy. The wives lead the heart. Turn it slowly, gradually, imperceptibly at first toward their gods, toward their practices, toward the worship that they require, that their presence makes seem reasonable, that love makes seem harmless, that the desire to please makes seem like small concession, like minor accommodation, like the compromise that marriage requires, that relationship demands, that living with others necessitates. But small concessions become large betrayals. Minor accommodations become major violations. The compromise that seems reasonable becomes the unfaithfulness that breaks covenant, that violates law, that turns the heart that should remain singular toward the Lord, that should worship only the God of Israel, that should keep the commandments that the dream's conditions specified. If you walk in my ways, if you keep my statutes, conditions that Solomon breaks through the marriages that the wives create, through the altars that love builds. Through the divided heart that 700 wives produce when wives are policies rather than persons, when marriages are arrangements rather than relationships, when the multiplication of wives multiplies also the gods, multiplies the altars, multiplies the divided loyalties that destroy the singular devotion that the covenant requires, that faithfulness demands, that Solomon promised but cannot maintain when the wives lead the heart, when desire overcomes devotion. When love for wives conflicts with love for God and love for wives wins because the wives are present and God seems distant, because the wives make demands and God seems silent, because the wives reward compliance and God's reward seems postponed, seems conditional, seems less immediate than the pleasure that pleasing wives provides, than the satisfaction that accommodating their demands creates, than the peace that building their altars purchases in the household even as it creates war with heaven. Even as it breaks covenant, even as it leads the heart that held the kingdom toward the disaster that the divided heart creates, that the foreign gods bring, that the wives lead Solomon into despite his wisdom, despite his knowledge, despite everything that should prevent it but cannot prevent it because the heart is led, is turned, is drawn by the wives who hold it, who have claims upon it, who use their intimacy to move it toward their gods, toward their worship. And toward the divided loyalty that destroys the singular devotion that covenant requires. The judgment comes, the prophet arrives. Announces that because Solomon has not kept covenant, because his heart has been led away, because the high places have been built and the foreign gods have been honored, the kingdom will be torn from his son, will be divided, will be split between north and south, between Israel and Judah, between the 10 tribes that will be taken and the 1 tribe that will remain for David's sake, for Jerusalem's sake, for the promises' sake that cannot be entirely broken even when covenant is violated. Even when faithfulness fails, even when the king who was wise becomes foolish, when the builder of the temple becomes builder of high places, when the heart that held the kingdom is led by the wives who held the heart toward the tragedy that love creates, that desire produces, that 700 wives bring to Solomon whose wisdom could not save him from the folly that love led him into, that the wives created, that the divided heart produced. That the tragedy teaches that wisdom is not enough when the heart is led, that knowledge cannot protect when love draws away, that even Solomon with all his wisdom could not resist the wives who led the heart that held the kingdom, who turned it toward foreign gods, who brought the judgment that would divide what Solomon united, that would destroy what Solomon built, that would end the glory that Solomon created through ending the faithfulness that the glory required, that the covenant demanded. That the wives destroyed through leading the heart, through turning the devotion, through creating the divided loyalty that makes singular devotion impossible, that makes faithfulness fail, that makes the wise king foolish, that makes Solomon into warning as much as example, into tragedy as much as triumph, into the teaching that the wives provide through leading the heart that multiplication of wives is not multiplication of joy, that political marriages are not personal relationships. That 700 wives create loneliness rather than curing it, create division rather than unity, create the disaster that the law anticipated, that Deuteronomy warned against, that Solomon discovered when the wives led the heart that held the kingdom toward the foreign gods, toward the divided loyalty, toward the judgment that would split the kingdom as the heart was split, that would divide what should have remained united, that the wives created, that love led to, that the heart followed despite wisdom. And despite warning, despite everything that should have prevented it but could not prevent it because the wives led the heart and the heart held the kingdom, and when the heart was led, the kingdom followed toward division, toward disaster, toward the end of the glory that the wives destroyed through leading the heart that held the kingdom. In legends that Scripture hints at but does not tell, in traditions that grew from silences, in the lore that fills the spaces where the canonical text stops speaking, Solomon possessed a ring inscribed with the ineffable name, with the 4 letters that Jews do not pronounce, with the tetragrammaton that grants authority over the invisible realm, over demons and jinn and spirits that serve or resist depending on whether they are commanded by one who possesses the authority that the ring conferred. That the name granted, that made Solomon master not only of Israel but master also of the hidden world where demons dwell in darkness and jinn wander in deserts and spirits obey the one who holds the ring, who speaks the name, who commands what should not be commanded because the invisible realm is dangerous, because spirits are treacherous, because demons serve only under compulsion and wait for the opportunity to betray, to escape, to reverse the power that the ring imposes, that the name compels. That Solomon wields in the legends that Islamic and Jewish traditions elaborate, that Christian legends adopt, that folklore preserves in stories of demons forced to build the temple, of jinn commanded to bring treasures from earth's ends, of spirits bound to Solomon's will through the power of the ring that he wore on his finger, that gave him dominion over realms that should remain beyond human control. That granted him mastery over powers that humans should not master because mastery over demons is dangerous even for the wise, is perilous even for the one who possesses the ring, is the power that legends celebrate but also warn against. The seal of Solomon, the ring is called bearing the 6-pointed star, the hexagram that later becomes symbol of Judaism but that first appears in legends of Solomon's ring, the seal that bears the name, that grants the power, that makes demons obey when the ring is shown, when the name is spoken, when Solomon commands what should not be commanded but what the ring makes commandable, what the name makes controllable, what the power makes possible despite the danger, despite the warning. Despite the recognition that commanding demons is presumption, that wielding such authority is hubris, that attempting to control what should remain free is the mistake that brings judgment, that creates disaster, that legends describe even as they celebrate, that traditions warn against even as they narrate, that the stories preserve in the ambiguity that makes them powerful is the ring gift or curse? Is the power blessing or temptation? Is commanding demons wisdom's tool or wisdom's transgression? The legends tell of Asmodeus, king of demons, captured by Solomon through the ring's power, bound to Solomon's will, forced to serve in building the temple, compelled against his nature to labor for the God he opposes, to create the sanctuary he despises, to participate in the work he resists but cannot resist when the ring commands, when the name compels, when Solomon's authority makes resistance futile. The legends tell also of Asmodeus's revenge, of how the demon king tricks Solomon into removing the ring, into surrendering the power, into losing the authority that made him master. And once the ring is removed, Asmodeus takes Solomon's form, sits on Solomon's throne, rules Solomon's kingdom while Solomon wanders as beggar, unrecognized, powerless. Reduced to nothing while the demon wears his face and possesses his palace, and enjoys his wives and rules his people, and none can tell the difference because the demon king wears Solomon's appearance, speaks with Solomon's voice, acts with Solomon's authority, while the real Solomon begs for bread and proclaims, "I am Solomon," and is called madman, is dismissed as delusional, is driven away by guards who serve the demon thinking they serve the king, who bow to the impostor thinking they honor Solomon, who cannot recognize that the king they serve is not the king they think they serve, because the demon's disguise is perfect, because the ring's power extends even to appearance, because Asmodeus possesses not only Solomon's throne but Solomon's very identity, while Solomon possesses nothing, is nothing, has nothing except the truth that no one believes, the identity that no one recognizes, the claim that everyone dismisses as madness. The legends vary in how Solomon regains the ring, regains his throne, regains his identity. Some say he finds the ring in a fish's belly, reminiscent of Jonah's rescue, reminiscent of the way God preserves what humans lose, reminiscent of grace that intervenes when power fails, when authority is lost, when the king is reduced to beggar and can do nothing to save himself, can only wait for the recovery that comes not through his effort but through providence, through the fish that swallows the ring and is caught and is opened and yields what was lost, returns what was taken, restores what was surrendered when Solomon removed the ring, when he trusted the demon, when he believed that power could be safely set aside, that authority could be temporarily surrendered, that the ring could be removed without consequence, the mistake that cost him everything, that reduced him to nothing, that taught him what the ring meant through losing it, through discovering that the power he possessed defined him, that the authority the ring granted was who he was, that without the ring he was nothing, was no one. It was the beggar that no one believed when he claimed to be king. Other legends tell different endings. They tell that Solomon never fully recovered from the loss, that even when ring was regained and throne was restored, something was different, was diminished, was broken through the time when demon ruled and Solomon wandered, when impostor possessed what was his and he possessed nothing, when the kingdom continued without him and none noticed his absence because the demon's impersonation was perfect. Because the ring's power made the demon into Solomon more perfectly than Solomon himself could be Solomon once he lost the ring, lost the power, lost the authority that made him king. The legends suggest that the experience changed Solomon, made him bitter, made him doubt, made him question whether kingship was worth the price, whether power was worth the danger, whether commanding demons was achievement or was folly, whether the ring was gift or was curse, whether the authority over spirits was blessing or was the presumption that brought the fall, that created the wandering, that reduced the king to beggar, and taught through reducing what the legends teach, that commanding demons is dangerous, that wielding power over spirits is perilous, that attempting to control what should remain beyond control is the mistake that even Solomon made, that even the wisest could not avoid, that even the one who possessed the ring could not manage safely because demons wait for their moment, because spirits seek revenge, because the power that compels also creates resentment that waits to reverse the compelling, that seeks opportunity to overthrow the compeller, that makes mastery temporary, makes authority provisional. Makes the ring into danger as much as into power, makes commanding demons into the act that brings its own punishment, that creates its own disaster, that the legends preserve as warning even as they celebrate as achievement. Perhaps the legends are metaphor. Perhaps Solomon never possessed actual ring, never commanded literal demons, never was literally overthrown by Asmodeus and reduced to wandering. And perhaps the stories are ways of talking about power's dangers, about authority's temptations, about the hubris of believing that wisdom grants right to control what should remain free, that understanding gives authority to command what should not be commanded, that the gift of wisdom includes permission to wield powers that even wisdom cannot safely wield, that even understanding cannot fully control. That even the wisest king should not attempt to master, because mastery over demons is mastery that destroys those who achieve it. That authority over spirits is authority that enslaves those who claim it. That the ring that makes master makes also prisoner of the power it grants, of the authority it confers, of the demons it controls until the control lapses and the revenge comes and the master becomes servant and the king becomes beggar, and the one who commanded is commanded by those he commanded, is overthrown by those he mastered, is reduced by those he controlled in the reversal that the legends describe, that the stories warn about, that the ring represents that some powers should not be wielded, that some authorities should not be claimed, that commanding demons is commanding disaster, that the ring that should not be possessed is the ring that legends celebrate and scripture remains silent about, that tradition elaborates while canon excludes, that folklore preserves while orthodoxy questions. That the teaching maintains in ambiguity, in warning in the stories that say both Solomon possessed the ring and the ring possessed Solomon. Both Solomon commanded demons and demons commanded Solomon. Both the ring was power and the ring was danger. Both Solomon mastered spirits and spirits mastered Solomon in the legends that teach through ambiguity, through warning, through preserving the mystery of the ring that commanded what should not be commanded. Behind the veil in the Holy of Holies, where darkness is not absence of light but is presence of mystery, where the sacred is protected by the darkness that conceals it, that preserves it, that makes it approachable only once yearly by the high priest alone. The ark rests holding the tablets that Moses brought from Sinai, holding the law that defines covenant, holding the testimony that binds Israel to God and God to Israel. Holding what cannot be seen because holiness this concentrated cannot be looked upon, because the presence between the cherubim is too powerful to be approached casually, too dangerous to be encountered without proper preparation, without proper sacrifice, without the proper fear that recognizes that the darkness holds not emptiness but holds fullness too great to be seen, holds presence too powerful to be approached except through mediation, holds the sacred that the darkness protects, that the veil guards. that the Holy of Holies preserves in the chamber where no light penetrates, where no windows break the walls, where no lamps illuminate the space, where the darkness is complete, is absolute, is the condition in which the ark dwells, in which the tablets rest, in which the presence remains hidden from all except the high priest who enters trembling once yearly on Yom Kippur when atonement must be made, when blood must be sprinkled on the mercy seat that covers the ark, when the veil must be crossed and the darkness must be entered and the Holy of Holies must receive the one who comes not casually but comes prepared, comes purified, comes with the awareness that to approach inappropriately is to approach death, that the darkness protects not only the holy from the profane but protects also the profane from the holy, protects human life from divine holiness that human sin cannot survive unmediated. That requires the system of priesthood and sacrifice and ritual purity that makes approach possible without making approach casual. That creates the narrow way through which the high priest can enter the darkness where the ark dwells, can approach the mercy seat where atonement is made, can survive the encounter with holiness that would destroy those who approached improperly, who came unprepared, who entered the darkness without proper authorization, without proper purification, without proper sacrifice. The cherubim guard the ark-winged figures crafted of gold, their wings spreading above the mercy seat, their faces looking toward each other and downward toward the seat that covers the ark, that conceals the tablets, that provides the place where blood is sprinkled, where atonement happens, where the high priest performs the ritual that maintains covenant, that sustains relationship, that makes it possible for holy God to dwell among sinful people, and for the presence to remain in the temple despite the unworthiness of those who worship there, despite the failures that accumulate, despite the sins that would drive God away if atonement were not made, if blood were not shed, if the ritual were not performed that Yom Kippur requires, that the darkness witnesses, that the Holy of Holies contains in the chamber where the ark dwells between the cherubim whose wings create canopy above the mercy seat, whose presence suggests guardianship, whose placement recalls Eden where cherubim guarded the way to the tree of life after expulsion, where access was blocked, where return was prevented until atonement makes return possible, until sacrifice opens what sin closed, until blood restores what disobedience severed, until the way back to God becomes possible through the system that the ark represents, that the mercy seat provides, that the Holy of Holies contains in the darkness where the ark dwells. The tablets within the ark are the covenant itself, the 10 words that God spoke on Sinai, that Moses received in fire and cloud, that were written by God's finger on stone, that define what God requires, what Israel promises, what the relationship demands from both parties, what binds them together in the covenant that the ark holds, that the tablets preserve, that the darkness protects in the Holy of Holies where they remain unseen, where they rest in the ark that no one can approach except through proper mediation, where the law that governs Israel's life dwells in the darkness that only the high priest enters, that only atonement makes accessible, that preserves the tablets as too sacred to be casually viewed, too holy to be commonly accessed, too central to covenant to be anything less than protected by darkness, by veil, by the restrictions that make approach dangerous. that make the Holy of Holies into the most sacred space in the temple, into the chamber that defines what the temple exists to house, into the darkness where the ark dwells, holding what Israel cannot see but must obey, holding what remains hidden but governs all, holding in darkness what light cannot illuminate because illumination would diminish, would make common, would transform mystery into mere object, presence into mere thing, sacred into mere possession. When what the darkness preserves is the mystery that must remain mysterious, the presence that must remain veiled, the sacred that must remain protected if it is to remain sacred, if holiness is to be honored, if the covenant is to be maintained in the ark that dwells in darkness absolute. Once yearly the high priest enters. Yom Kippur comes. The Day of Atonement arrives when the accumulated sins of the year must be addressed, when the breach between holy God and sinful people must be repaired, when blood must be shed and carried behind the veil, when the high priest must strip away his glorious garments and wear only white linen, must purify himself through prescribed washings, must offer sacrifice first for his own sins and then for the people's sins, must take blood from the sacrificed animals and carry it through the veil, must enter the darkness where the ark dwells, must approach the mercy seat where he cannot see but must act by touch and by memory, must sprinkle the blood 7 times before the mercy seat, must perform the ritual that makes atonement, that maintains covenant, that enables God to continue dwelling among people who fail continuously to keep the covenant that the ark holds, that the tablets define, that the darkness preserves in the Holy of Holies where the high priest trembles, where the ritual is performed with the awareness that error means death, that improper approach means not leaving the darkness alive, that the holiness concentrated here is dangerous, is not to be treated casually, is the reason that entrance is restricted, that access is limited, that only the high priest enters only once yearly, only after proper preparation, only with proper sacrifice, only with the blood that makes atonement possible, that repairs the breach, that maintains the relationship that sin damages but that sacrifice repairs, that failure threatens but that atonement preserves, that the ritual in the darkness sustains, that the high priest's yearly entrance into the Holy of Holies enables, that the blood sprinkled on the mercy seat accomplishes in the darkness where the ark dwells. The people wait outside while the high priest is in the darkness. Wait anxiously, wait fearfully. Wait knowing that if the high priest does not emerge, if the ritual is performed improperly, if the approach offends rather than appeases, then the high priest will die in the darkness and the people will be left without atonement, without mediation, without the priest who can enter the Holy of Holies, without the means of maintaining covenant, of sustaining relationship, of remaining in connection with God who dwells in the temple but who will not dwell among unrepentant sinners, who will not remain where holiness is not honored, where the covenant is not kept, where the sacrifice is not offered that makes continued relationship possible. The waiting is prayer, is collective holding of breath, is the communal anxiety that is released when the high priest emerges from the darkness alive, when he appears from behind the veil, when he shows that the ritual was accepted, that atonement was made, that the covenant is maintained for another year, that God continues to dwell in the temple, that the presence remains in the Holy of Holies, that the ark continues to rest in the darkness where it dwells, where it holds the tablets, where it preserves the covenant in the chamber that only the high priest enters. That only the darkness protects, that only the veil conceals, that remains the most sacred space because it is the most hidden space, because the darkness preserves what light would diminish, because the concealment protects what exposure would profane, because the ark that dwells in darkness absolute dwells there rightly, dwells there safely, dwells there in the sacred protection that darkness provides. The darkness teaches what light cannot teach, that mystery is essential, that some things should remain hidden, that the sacred is preserved through concealment rather than through display, that holiness requires boundaries, that approaching God requires mediation, that the casual access to the holy is not privilege but is danger, is not gift but is presumption, is not intimacy but is violation of the boundaries that protect both the holy from profanation and the unholy from destruction. That maintain the separation that makes relationship possible, that preserve the distance that makes approach meaningful, that keep the ark in darkness where it dwells, teaching what it teaches through the darkness itself, that God is mystery. That holiness is dangerous, that covenant requires more than good intentions, that maintaining relationship with holy God requires system of mediation, of sacrifice, of priesthood, of the annual ritual that the darkness witnesses, that the Holy of Holies contains. That the high priest performs in the chamber where the ark dwells in darkness absolute, where the tablets rest unseen, where the presence remains hidden, where the covenant is preserved in the darkness that protects, that conceals, that makes sacred what light would make common, that honors through hiding what display would dishonor, that preserves through darkness what exposure would destroy, that keeps the ark in the Holy of Holies, in the darkness absolute, in the sacred concealment where it dwells rightly. Where it teaches truly, where it preserves the mystery that must remain mysterious if holiness is to remain holy, if sacred is to remain sacred, if the ark is to dwell as it should dwell in darkness absolute, where mystery is honored, where holiness is protected, where the covenant is preserved in the chamber that Solomon built, that the temple houses, that the darkness fills, that the ark inhabits in the sacred concealment that makes approach possible without making approach casual. That preserves mystery without making mystery inaccessible, that maintains holiness without making holiness unapproachable. That keeps the ark in darkness where it dwells, teaching what it teaches, that the sacred requires darkness, that mystery requires concealment, that the ark dwells rightly in the darkness absolute where it remains, where it teaches, where it preserves the covenant in the Holy of Holies that only the high priest enters, that only the darkness protects, that only the veil guards. That remains forever in memory as the place where the ark dwelt in darkness absolute, where the sacred was honored through concealment, where mystery was preserved through darkness, where the covenant remained hidden in the chamber that the darkness filled, that the ark inhabited, that we remember as the holiest place because it was the darkest place, the most hidden place, the most protected place where the ark dwelt in darkness absolute, teaching what it taught, that darkness protects, that concealment honors. That mystery is gift, that the ark dwells rightly in the darkness where it dwelt, where it rests in memory, where it remains in the tradition that preserves the teaching of the darkness, of the concealment of the ark that dwelt in darkness absolute. The gold shields that hung in the house of the forest of Lebanon, each shield beaten from 600 shekels of gold, reflecting torchlight in the night when Solomon's court gathered, when ambassadors came, when the splendor was displayed that proclaimed Israel's wealth, that demonstrated Solomon's glory, that testified to the prosperity that wisdom created, that peace enabled, that the golden age produced. These shields vanished when Shishak of Egypt invaded in Rehoboam's time, were taken as plunder. Were replaced with bronze shields that looked like gold but were not gold, that maintained appearance but lost substance, that marked the beginning of decline, the start of the diminishment that would continue until Babylon came and took not imitations but everything that remained, everything. That bronze shields represented the temple vessels, the lampstands and bowls and censers, all the gold that Solomon overlaid on walls and doors and furnishings. All the treasures that generations accumulated after Solomon, all the sacred objects that served worship, that enabled sacrifice, that made the temple function as temple, as the place where God dwelt, where Israel worshipped, where the covenant was maintained through the rituals that the vessels enabled, that the treasures facilitated, that the gold and silver made possible, all vanished when Babylon came, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered, when Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE. When the temple that Solomon built burned, when the kingdom that David established ended, when everything that the Golden Age created was destroyed in days, was looted in hours, was carried to Babylon as spoils of conquest, as testimony to Babylon's power, as the treasures that Israel could not protect, that Solomon's wisdom could not preserve beyond his lifetime, beyond his son's reign, beyond the generations that followed until Babylon came and took everything. The throne of ivory overlaid with finest gold, with 6 steps ascending to the seat, with lions standing beside each step, 12 lions total representing the 12 tribes, with armrests supported by lions, with back rising high above the seat, the throne that represented Solomon's kingship, that displayed his majesty, that was unlike any throne in any kingdom, that proclaimed through its craftsmanship and its materials that Israel's king was great among kings, was wealthy among the wealthy, was glorious among the glorious. This throne vanished, was taken or was destroyed or was hidden, the text does not say. Exists now only in description, only in the memory that preserves what conquest took, that records what destruction scattered, that maintains through telling what could not be maintained through keeping, what could not be protected through guarding, what Babylon took when Babylon came. The temple vessels, the golden lampstand that burned continually before the veil, the table of showbread that held the 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes, the altar of incense where fragrant smoke ascended, the great altar of sacrifice where offerings were made, the bronze sea that held water for priestly washings, the 10 bronze stands with basins, all the implements of worship, all the tools of sacrifice, all the objects that made temple worship possible, all vanished when Babylon came. Some were carried to Babylon, some were broken, some were melted for their metal. Some simply disappeared in the chaos of conquest, in the destruction of Jerusalem, in the burning of the temple when everything that could burn burned and everything that could be taken was taken and everything that remained was broken, was destroyed. was the rubble that the returning exiles would find when they came back from Babylon 70 years later, when they returned to rebuild, when they came to construct the second temple that could never equal the first, that could never recover what was lost, that could never restore the treasures that vanished when Babylon came. The ark itself did it vanish with the other treasures. The text is silent. Second Temple sources never mention the ark in the Holy of Holies. The rabbis debated where it went. Some said Josiah hid it before Babylon came. Some said it was taken to Babylon and lost. Some said it was hidden in a cave, in a chamber beneath the Temple Mount, waiting to be discovered when the Messiah comes, when the temple is rebuilt, when the treasures are restored. The legends proliferate because the silence is unbearable, because the ark cannot simply vanish, because what the ark represented, the covenant, the presence, the testimony, cannot be reduced to lost object, cannot be merely treasure that Babylon took, cannot be simply plunder that conquest claimed. The ark must be hidden rather than destroyed, must be preserved rather than lost, must remain somewhere waiting rather than be gone forever, because if the ark is gone, then what is lost is not merely object but is presence, is not merely treasure but is covenant, is not merely sacred vessel but is the means by which God dwelt in the temple, by which the presence remained in Israel, by which the covenant was preserved in the darkness of the Holy of Holies, where the ark dwelt until it dwelt no longer. Until it vanished, until it was taken or hidden or destroyed, and no one knows which, no one can say with certainty. No one witnessed what happened to the ark when Babylon came, when the temple burned, when everything was lost. The loss is immeasurable, is not merely material, is not simply the value of gold and silver and precious objects. It is the loss of what the treasures represented: the glory of Solomon's reign, the prosperity of the Golden Age, the splendor of the temple, the physical manifestation of God's presence, the tangible signs of covenant blessing, the objects that enabled worship, that made sacrifice possible, that maintained ritual, that preserved tradition. When the treasures vanished, what vanished was not just wealth but was the visible testimony to God's favor, was the physical evidence of blessing, was the material foundation of worship that Second Temple would struggle to restore, that returning exiles would attempt to rebuild, that would never be fully recovered because the treasures that vanished when Babylon came took with them something that could not be recovered: the innocence of believing that covenant blessing was permanent, that temple glory was secure, that what Solomon built would endure, that the treasures would be preserved because God dwelt in the temple, and surely God would protect what God inhabited, would preserve what God sanctified, would maintain what God established through Solomon's wisdom, through David's preparation, through the covenant that promised blessing if Israel remained faithful, if the commandments were kept, if the ways were walked that the conditions at Gibon specified, that the covenant demanded. That Israel failed to maintain, and that the vanished treasures testified to the failure, to the unfaithfulness, to the broken covenant that the loss represented. Yet some treasures returned. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, when he issued the decree allowing Jews to return to Jerusalem, when he commanded that the temple be rebuilt, He also returned vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken 5,400 articles of gold and silver that Sheshbazzar the prince brought back to Jerusalem, that were restored to the temple, that testified that not all was lost, that something could be recovered, that Babylon's conquest was not the final word, that exile was not permanent, that the treasures could return even if they could never fully restore what was lost, even if Second Temple could never equal the first, even if the returning exiles wept when they saw the foundation because they remembered Solomon's temple and knew that what was being rebuilt was diminished, was less glorious, was missing the ark, was missing much of the splendor. It was the attempt to restore what could not be fully restored because the treasures that vanished when Babylon came took with them something that could not be recovered, the confidence that blessing was secure, that glory would endure, that covenant was unbreakable, that what Solomon built would last forever because God had established it, and surely God's establishment was permanent. The loss teaches what it teaches through teaching loss, that nothing material is permanent, that even temple treasures can vanish, that even sacred objects can be taken, that even the glory of Solomon's reign can end, that covenant blessing is conditional, that faithfulness matters, that the treasures that represent blessing can be lost when the blessing is forfeited through unfaithfulness, through disobedience, through the failures that accumulate until judgment comes, until Babylon conquers. Until the temple burns and the treasures vanish and all that remains is memory of what was lost, awareness of what cannot be recovered, the teaching that the vanished treasures provide, that we should not trust in treasures, should not depend on material signs of blessing, should not assume that what we possess we will keep, that what we build will endure, that what we treasure will remain because the treasures vanished, because Babylon came, because everything that seemed secure was taken. Everything that seemed permanent was destroyed. Everything that seemed to promise endurance proved temporary when Babylon came and took the treasures that vanished, that were lost, that remain now only in the memory that preserves them, in the tradition that maintains them, in the stories that tell of what was and what was lost, what Solomon built and what Babylon destroyed, what the Golden Age created and what judgment took away. What the treasures were and what their vanishing teaches, that covenant blessing is conditional, that material glory is temporary, that treasures can vanish, that the treasures of Solomon that seemed permanent proved temporary, that seemed secure proved vulnerable, that seemed to promise endurance taught through vanishing, that nothing endures except what cannot be taken, except what survives conquest, except what remains when treasures vanish, the memory, the tradition. The covenant itself that the treasures served, but that does not depend on treasures, that the temple housed but that transcends temples, that physical objects represented but that survives when physical objects vanish. That remains when the treasures are gone, when Babylon has taken everything, when only memory preserves what conquest took, when only tradition maintains what destruction scattered. When the treasures that vanished when Babylon came teach through vanishing what they could not teach through remaining, that nothing material is permanent, that covenant does not depend on treasures, that God's presence is not bound to objects, that what matters most survives when treasures vanish, when temples burn, when everything material is lost except what cannot be lost because it was never merely material, never merely treasure, never merely object but was always and remains still the covenant. The relationship, the presence that treasures represented but could not contain, that temples housed but could not limit, that objects served but did not define, that remains when treasures vanish, when Babylon comes, when everything is taken except what cannot be taken, what cannot be lost. What the vanished treasures teach through vanishing, that God remains when treasures are gone, that covenant survives when temples burn. That what matters most endures when everything material vanishes, as the treasures vanished when Babylon came. He who answered every riddle could not answer his own ending. He who judged rightly between mothers could not judge rightly in his own heart. He who built the temple could not build the faithfulness that would preserve the kingdom. The wisdom that solved every problem could not solve the problem of the wise man himself, could not prevent the folly that age brought, could not protect against the wives who led the heart, could not maintain the devotion that youth possessed, could not preserve the purity that the dream at Gibon created, could not save Solomon from himself, from his desires, from his weaknesses, from the vulnerabilities that even wisdom cannot fully protect against, because wisdom is knowledge but is not virtue. Is understanding but is not will, is the capacity to judge rightly but is not the power to choose rightly when choice conflicts with desire, when knowledge confronts appetite, when understanding meets the human weaknesses that wisdom describes but cannot overcome, that Solomon possessed but could not master, that wisdom illuminated but could not eliminate. The tragedy unfolds slowly, is not sudden fall but is gradual decline. Is not dramatic betrayal but is slow accumulation of small compromises, of minor accommodations, of the compromises that seem reasonable at the time, that appear necessary for peace, that look like wisdom itself marrying foreign wives to secure alliances, building high places to please the wives, honoring their gods to maintain household harmony, making the concessions that politics requires, that relationships demand, that seem like the flexibility that wisdom should possess. That understanding should enable, that the capacity to see multiple perspectives should create, but the compromises accumulate, the small concessions become large betrayals, the flexibility becomes unfaithfulness. The wisdom that could navigate complexity becomes the rationalization for disobedience, becomes the excuse for breaking covenant, becomes the means by which Solomon justifies to himself what he knows violates the law, what he understands breaks the covenant, what his wisdom should prevent but what his wisdom instead enables, because wisdom can rationalize as well as it can reason, can justify as well as it can judge, can explain away as well as it can explain. It can become the tool of self-deception rather than the means of self-knowledge when the wise man does not want to see what wisdom shows, when understanding reveals what the heart does not want to acknowledge, when knowledge convicts but the will refuses to obey. The irony is profound that wisdom cannot save the wise man, that understanding cannot preserve the one who understands, that knowledge cannot protect the knower from the folly that knowledge should prevent but does not prevent because knowing and doing are different. because understanding and obeying are separate, because wisdom that sees clearly can coexist with will that chooses poorly, because the heart can be divided even when the mind is clear, because desire can override understanding. Because love can lead astray despite knowledge that warns where love leads, because Solomon possessed wisdom in fullness but possessed also humanity in fullness, possessed the weaknesses that wisdom describes but cannot eliminate, possessed the vulnerabilities that knowledge reveals but cannot remove, possessed the capacity for self-deception that even understanding cannot fully overcome when the self does not want truth, when the heart resists what the mind knows. When desire conflicts with duty and desire wins despite wisdom, despite understanding, despite knowledge that should determine choice but that proves insufficient when choice is made. When the moment comes, when the wives ask and love compels and the high places are built despite the law, despite the covenant, despite the wisdom that knows this is wrong but that cannot prevent it because wisdom is not enough, because knowledge does not save. Because understanding cannot overcome the human condition that makes even Solomon vulnerable, that makes even the wisest foolish when desire misleads, when love leads astray, when the heart is divided between conflicting loyalties and chooses wrongly despite knowing better. Ecclesiastes is the confession. It is the acknowledgement that wisdom has limits, that understanding has boundaries, that knowledge cannot answer all questions, cannot solve all problems, cannot provide what wisdom promises, the meaning that makes life worthwhile, the satisfaction that makes achievement fulfilling, the purpose that makes striving meaningful. All is vanity. The confession is Solomon's, is the wise man acknowledging that wisdom itself is insufficient, that understanding cannot provide what humans need most, that knowledge cannot save from the meaninglessness that death creates, from the futility that mortality imposes, from the vanity that honest assessment reveals when the wisest man looks at his own life and sees despite all the wisdom, despite all the achievement, despite all the glory, only vanity, only chasing after wind. Only the emptiness that wisdom cannot fill, that knowledge cannot satisfy, that understanding cannot overcome because wisdom is gift but is not salvation, is illumination but is not redemption, is capacity for judgment but is not power for transformation, is what Solomon possessed in fullness but what could not save him from the folly he fell into, from the unfaithfulness he committed, from the divided heart he developed, from the tragedy that his reign became when wisdom proved insufficient. When understanding could not preserve, when knowledge could not protect the wise man from himself, the divided kingdom is the result, is the consequence of Solomon's unfaithfulness. Is the judgment that the prophet announced because you have not kept my covenant, because your heart was led away after other gods. The kingdom will be torn from your son, will be divided, will be split between north and south, between Israel and Judah, will be diminished from the glory that your wisdom created, will suffer the consequences that your folly brought, will demonstrate through division what your heart demonstrated through dividing. That covenant blessing is conditional. That wisdom without faithfulness is insufficient, that knowledge without obedience is inadequate, that understanding without devotion cannot preserve what devotion alone maintains, cannot protect what faithfulness alone guards, cannot save what only covenant loyalty can save from the judgment that comes, from the division that results, from the decline that follows when wisdom is not enough, when the wise man falls, when the one who possessed understanding could not be saved by the understanding he possessed. Yet the wisdom remains, is preserved in Proverbs, in Ecclesiastes, in Song of Songs, in the tradition that maintains Solomon's teachings even while acknowledging Solomon's failures, that preserves the wisdom even while recording the folly, that honors the gift even while lamenting the tragedy, that recognizes that wisdom is valuable even when wisdom is insufficient, that understanding matters even when understanding cannot save, that knowledge serves even when knowledge does not redeem. That Solomon's wisdom teaches even though Solomon's wisdom could not save Solomon from Solomon, could not protect the wise man from the weaknesses that wisdom revealed but could not eliminate, could not prevent the tragedy that wisdom should have prevented but did not prevent because wisdom is not enough, because knowledge is not salvation, because understanding is not redemption, because even Solomon with all his wisdom needed more than wisdom, needed what wisdom could not provide. Needed grace that wisdom cannot earn, needed transformation that knowledge cannot achieve, needed salvation that understanding cannot accomplish. Needed what the wisdom that could not save the one who possessed it points toward through its insufficiency, through its limits, through the tragedy that demonstrates that wisdom is gift but is not the final gift, is illumination but is not the ultimate illumination, is capacity for judgment but is not the power for transformation, is what we need but is not all we need. Is what Solomon possessed but what could not save Solomon, is what we can seek but what alone cannot deliver us, is the wisdom that teaches through failing to save that we need more than wisdom, that salvation requires more than knowledge, that redemption demands more than understanding, that the wise man who could not be saved by wisdom teaches us that wisdom is not enough, that we need grace beyond wisdom, power beyond knowledge, transformation beyond understanding. The salvation that wisdom points toward but cannot provide, that knowledge indicates but cannot achieve, that understanding describes but cannot deliver, that Solomon needed but could not find through wisdom alone, that we need but cannot earn through knowledge alone, that the wisdom which could not save the one who possessed it teaches us to seek beyond wisdom, to look beyond knowledge, and to reach beyond understanding toward what wisdom cannot give but what wisdom's insufficiency reveals. We need the salvation that comes not through wisdom but through grace, not through knowledge but through gift, not through understanding but through transformation that only God can provide, that wisdom cannot earn, that knowledge cannot achieve, that understanding cannot accomplish, that Solomon needed and that the tragedy of his reign teaches us we need. That the wisdom which could not save the one who possessed it teaches us to seek from beyond wisdom, from beyond knowledge, from beyond the understanding that shows us our need but cannot meet our need, that reveals our condition but cannot remedy our condition, that makes us wise but cannot make us saved, that makes us understanding but cannot make us whole, that makes us knowledgeable but cannot make us redeemed, that the wisdom which could not save the one who possessed it teaches through its insufficiency. Through its limits, through the tragedy that it could not prevent, through the fall that it could not avoid, through Solomon's failure that wisdom's limits created, that wisdom's insufficiency enabled, that teaches what we need, not less wisdom but more than wisdom. Not rejection of knowledge but recognition that knowledge is not enough. Not abandonment of understanding but acknowledgement that understanding cannot save us from ourselves, from our desires, from our weaknesses. And from the human condition that even Solomon's wisdom could not overcome, that even the wisest man could not escape. That the wisdom which could not save the one who possessed it teaches us to acknowledge, to accept, to seek remedy for beyond wisdom, beyond knowledge, beyond understanding, in the grace that saves where wisdom cannot save, in the power that redeems where knowledge cannot redeem, in the transformation that delivers where understanding cannot deliver, that Solomon needed, that we need. That the wisdom which could not save the one who possessed it teaches us to seek. Night falls over Jerusalem where the temple once stood, where Solomon's glory once shone, where the wisdom once answered riddles and the wealth once dazzled queens and the power once ruled from Dan to Beersheba, where all the achievement has ended, where all the treasures have vanished, where all the wisdom has been tested and found wanting, where the kingdom split and fell and disappeared except in the memory that outlasted the kingdom, except in the stories that survived the conquest, except in the tradition that preserved what history destroyed, that maintained what Babylon scattered, that kept alive through telling what could not be kept alive through power, through wealth, through wisdom, through any of the achievements that Solomon accomplished but that could not preserve themselves, could not outlast their own ending, could not survive except in the memory that honored them by remembering, that preserved them by telling, that kept them alive through the tradition that we inherit, that we continue. That we pass on through telling still the stories of Solomon. The memory persists, survives when kingdom falls, endures when temple burns, continues when power ends, maintains when glory fades. Preserves through the dark centuries what bright centuries created, through the exile what the golden age built, through the dispersion what the United Kingdom gathered, through the loss what the achievement won, through the ending what the beginning promised, through the tragedy what the triumph demonstrated, through the confession what the wisdom proclaimed, through the failure what the success established, through the vanishing what the glory displayed, through the silence what the songs celebrated, through the absence what the presence filled. Through the death what the life created, through the forgetting what the remembering maintains, through all that destroys what the memory preserves, the stories of Solomon who dreamed at Gibon, who judged between mothers, who built the temple, who received the queen, who wrote songs and proverbs, who confessed vanity, who was led by wives, who commanded demons in legends, who housed the ark in darkness, who accumulated treasures that vanished, who possessed wisdom that could not save him, who became the wise king whose wisdom was gift and whose folly was tragedy, whose reign was glory and whose end was decline, whose achievements were magnificent and whose failures were catastrophic, whose life teaches through both success and failure, through both building and destroying, through both the wisdom that God granted and the folly that Solomon committed, through everything that Solomon was and everything that Solomon teaches. The tradition maintains the memory. It preserves through telling what time should erase, what conquest should destroy, what the centuries should scatter. Keeps alive through story what death should end, what failure should erase, what tragedy should silence. Honors through remembering what history would forget, what time would lose, what the passing generations would bury in the past if memory did not retrieve it. If tradition did not maintain it, if the stories were not told again and again, generation after generation, keeping Solomon alive not through the kingdom that ended, not through the temple that burned, not through the treasures that vanished, but through the memory that endures, through the stories that survive, through the tradition that continues in us who tell still. Who remember still, who preserve through telling what cannot be preserved through any other means because the memory outlasted the kingdom, the stories survived the conquest, the tradition maintained what power could not protect, what wealth could not preserve, what wisdom could not save. We tell still of the dream at Gibon where wisdom chose the dreamer, where Solomon asked not for himself but for his people, where the gift was granted that would define a reign, that would create a legend, that would make Solomon's name synonymous with wisdom even though wisdom could not save Solomon from folly, even though the reign that began in glory ended in division, even though the kingdom that wisdom built wisdom could not preserve because wisdom is not enough, because knowledge is not salvation. Because understanding is not redemption, because Solomon teaches through his wisdom and through his folly, through his success and through his failure, through his glory and through his tragedy, through everything that he was and everything that he became, through the reign that we remember, that we preserve, that we honor through telling the stories that maintain Solomon's memory, that keep alive what time should kill, that preserve what history should destroy, that the tradition maintains through the telling that continues, that persists. That makes Solomon immortal not through his achievements, but through the memory that outlasted them. We tell still of the judgment between the mothers where the sword stopped before dividing the child, where wisdom saw what facts could not show, where understanding penetrated where evidence could not reach, where the judgment revealed truth through threatening horror, where Solomon demonstrated the gift that God granted, the wisdom that made him wise king, the understanding that made his judgment legendary, the capacity that made the story worth preserving, worth telling, worth passing on through generations that remember Solomon not for the buildings he built or the wealth he accumulated, but for the wisdom he demonstrated when he judged rightly, when he saw truly, when he understood deeply in the moment when judgment mattered, when truth needed revealing, when wisdom showed what wisdom is through the judgment that split hearts before swords. We tell still of the temple where silence learned to dwell in stone, where 7 years of building created the dwelling place for God, where the ark rested in darkness absolute, where sacrifices were offered and prayers ascended, where Israel oriented itself toward Jerusalem, toward the mountain, toward the sanctuary that Solomon built and that Babylon destroyed, but that memory preserves, that tradition maintains, that the stories keep alive in the telling that continues. That makes the temple live still in imagination even when the temple is gone, even when the mount is empty, even when the western wall is all that remains of the second temple that replaced the first but could never equal it. that tried to restore what was lost but could never fully recover what the Golden Age created, what Solomon built, what the temple was when it stood, when it functioned, when it housed the presence, when the silence dwelt in stone. We tell still of the queen who came to test what cannot be measured, who traveled from Sheba to Jerusalem to verify whether the reports were true, who questioned and was answered, who tested and found that testing confirmed rather than questioned, who learned that the half was not told because reality exceeded report, because Solomon surpassed reputation, because the wisdom was real and the wealth was authentic and the glory was genuine, because the queen departed blessing what she came doubting. Departed believing what she came questioning, departed transformed through the encounter that the journey enabled, that the testing revealed, that the meeting created when the queen met Solomon and discovered that wisdom must be encountered rather than merely reported, that excellence must be witnessed rather than merely described, that some realities exceed telling and can only be experienced, can only be known through presence, can only be appreciated through the meeting that the queen's journey made possible. That the tradition preserves, that the story maintains in the memory that outlasted the kingdom. We tell still of the songs where desire became prayer, where physical love was celebrated rather than suppressed, where bodies were honored rather than denied, where passion was expressed rather than hidden, where the Song of Songs speaks what tradition wants to allegorize but what perhaps should be heard as it is, as celebration of love, as honoring of desire, as the sacred made embodied, as the holy made physical, as prayer that desire becomes when expressed rightly, when celebrated openly. When honored as gift rather than feared as temptation, as the songs teach, as Solomon wrote or as tradition attributes to Solomon, as the wisdom that includes celebration of love, of desire, of the physical intimacy that God created and called good. We tell still of Ecclesiastes where vanity was confessed, where the wise man acknowledged wisdom's limits, where the achiever admitted achievement's emptiness, where Solomon or the one speaking as Solomon looked at life and saw meaninglessness, saw futility, saw the chasing after wind that all human striving becomes when measured against death, against eternity, against the questions that wisdom can ask but cannot answer, that understanding can pose but cannot solve, that knowledge can see but cannot satisfy. That Ecclesiastes describes with brutal honesty, with the pessimism that refuses false comfort, with the confession that makes the book seem dark, seem nihilistic, seem almost heretical, but that perhaps is the honesty that faith requires, that wisdom demands, that tradition preserves because vanity must be confessed if meaning is to be sought rightly. If satisfaction is to be found truly, if we are to recognize that wisdom is not enough, that knowledge cannot save, that understanding cannot redeem. That we need more than wisdom provides, more than achievement accomplishes, more than Ecclesiastes describes, but toward which Ecclesiastes points through describing what is not enough. We tell still of the wives who led the heart, who turned the wise king foolish, who brought the high places and the foreign gods, who divided the heart that held the kingdom, who created the tragedy that followed the glory, who led Solomon astray despite his wisdom, who demonstrated that even the wisest can fall when desire misleads, when love leads astray, when the heart is divided and devotion is compromised, when wives are multiplied and loyalty is diluted. When the political becomes personal and the personal becomes tragic in the story that the tradition preserves as warning, as teaching, as the remembering that Solomon fell, that wisdom was not enough, that even the wise king needed what wisdom could not provide, the faithfulness that would preserve devotion, the loyalty that would maintain covenant, the heart that would remain undivided when divided heart brings disaster. We tell still of the legends of the ring that commanded demons, that granted power over spirits, that made Solomon master of invisible realm, that enabled him to build the temple with demon labor, or to gather treasures from earth's ends, or to achieve what humans should not achieve, because commanding demons is dangerous, because power over spirits is perilous, because the ring that legends celebrate is also the ring that legends warn against, that represents both achievement and presumption. Both mastery and danger, both the power that wisdom seems to grant and the danger that wisdom cannot fully control, that the legends preserve in ambiguity, in warning, in the teaching that some powers should not be wielded even by the wise, that some authorities should not be claimed even by Solomon, that the ring teaches through the legends that survive, that the tradition maintains, that the memory preserves alongside the canonical stories, alongside the scripture that remains silent while folklore speaks. While legends elaborate, while the memory includes both what scripture says and what tradition adds, what text preserves and what imagination creates, what history records and what legend supplements in the full memory that outlasted the kingdom. We tell still of the Ark in the Holy of Holies, dwelling in darkness absolute, holding the tablets in the chamber that only the high priest entered, that only Yom Kippur opened, that only proper preparation made accessible, that taught through darkness what light could not teach, that mystery is essential, that holiness is dangerous, that the sacred requires boundaries, that approaching God requires mediation, that the Ark dwelt rightly in the darkness that protected, that concealed, that honored the sacred through hiding what display would profane, through preserving in darkness what exposure would diminish, through the Holy of Holies that memory maintains even when the temple is gone, even when the Ark has vanished, even when the darkness is gone, but the teaching remains, that darkness protected, that mystery honored, that the Ark dwelt rightly where it dwelt, in the darkness that the memory preserves, that the tradition maintains, that we remember still. We tell still of the treasures that vanished when Babylon came, when the conquest took what Solomon accumulated, when the temple burned and the vessels were carried away, when everything material was lost except what memory preserves, except what tradition maintains, except what the stories keep alive through telling what was lost. What vanished, what Babylon took, but what memory retrieves, what conquest scattered, but what tradition gathers, what destruction ended, but what remembering continues. What the treasures were and what their vanishing teaches, that nothing material is permanent, that covenant does not depend on treasures, that God's presence is not bound to objects, that what matters most survives when treasures vanish, when temples burn, when kingdoms fall, but memory endures. We tell still that Solomon's wisdom could not save Solomon, that the wise king fell despite wisdom, that knowledge was not enough to prevent folly, that understanding could not protect against failure, that even Solomon needed more than wisdom provided, needed grace that wisdom cannot earn, needed salvation that knowledge cannot achieve, needed transformation that understanding cannot accomplish, needed what the tragedy teaches through Solomon's failure, through wisdom's insufficiency. Through the fall that wisdom could not prevent, through the ending that demonstrates that wisdom is gift but is not final gift, is illumination but is not salvation, is capacity for judgment but is not power for redemption, is what Solomon possessed but what could not save Solomon, from his weaknesses, from his failures, from the tragedy that makes him both hero and warning, both achievement and failure. Both wise king and foolish man whose memory outlasted his kingdom because the memory teaches what the kingdom could not teach, preserves what power could not preserve, maintains what wisdom could not maintain, the full truth about Solomon, about wisdom, about the human condition that even wisdom cannot fully overcome, about the need we have for more than wisdom, for grace beyond knowledge, for salvation beyond understanding, for what Solomon needed and what we need. What the memory teaches through preserving both Solomon's wisdom and Solomon's folly, both his success and his failure, both his glory and his tragedy, both what he achieved and what he could not achieve, both what wisdom enabled and what wisdom could not prevent, both the gift and the limits, both the blessing and the curse, both the building and the destruction, both the beginning and the ending, both the dream at Gibon and the divided kingdom. Both everything that Solomon was and everything that Solomon teaches through being what he was, through falling as he fell, through the reign that we remember, that we preserve, that we honor, through telling still, through remembering still, through maintaining the memory that outlasted the kingdom, that survives still, that teaches still, that preserves still in us who tell, who remember, who continue the tradition that makes Solomon immortal through memory, eternal through story, preserved through the telling that continues, that persists, that maintains what time should destroy, what history should erase, what the centuries should scatter but cannot scatter because the memory outlasted the kingdom. The stories survived the fall, the tradition continues in the telling that we offer, that we maintain, that we pass on to those who follow, who will tell still of Solomon whose memory outlasted his kingdom, whose stories survived his tragedy, whose wisdom teaches despite his folly, whose reign endures in memory though it ended in division, whose temple stands in imagination though it burned in history, whose treasures remain in tradition though they vanished in conquest, whose name is remembered though his kingdom is forgotten, whose wisdom is honored though wisdom could not save him, whose story continues though his life ended, whose memory outlasted his kingdom and lives still in us who tell, who remember, who preserve through story what power could not preserve through might, what wealth could not maintain through abundance, what wisdom could not save through understanding, what only memory preserves, what only tradition maintains, what only story continues. Solomon, the wise king, whose memory outlasted his kingdom and who lives still in the stories we tell, in the tradition we honor, in the memory that endures. Sleep now. The night is deep. The stories are told. And Solomon lives in the telling, in the remembering, in the tradition that survives beyond kingdoms, beyond power, beyond everything except the memory that outlasts, the stories that preserve, the tradition that continues in us who tell still, who remember still, who honor through story the wise king whose memory outlasted his kingdom and who teaches through that memory what endures, not power, not wealth, not wisdom alone, but the stories we tell, the memories we preserve. The tradition we maintain through telling still, through remembering still, through the honoring that makes immortal, that makes eternal, that makes Solomon live in the memory that outlasted his kingdom and that lives in us still. Rest deeply, dream of wisdom, and wake remembering that the memory outlasts the kingdom, that stories survive what power cannot preserve, that we live in those who remember us, that we endure in the tradition of telling, of remembering, of honoring through story the wise king whose memory outlasted his kingdom and who lives still in us who tell, who remember, who preserve the memory that endures. Good night, the wise king sleeps, the memory keeps watch. And in the space between then and now, between the kingdom that fell and the memory that endures, Solomon lives still in the stories we tell, in the tradition we honor, in the memory that outlasted his kingdom and that will outlast us all. Sleep well, the memory endures, the stories survive, and we are held in the great tradition of remembering. Good night.